Day 0. The mall was supposed to be demolished in 6 weeks. That's the first thing I keep coming back to. 6 weeks. The wrecking crew was already scheduled. The permits were filed. And I was the guy they sent in to document what was still running before they knocked the whole thing down. Building automation survey. That's the job. Go in, connect to the BAS, pull the system logs, figure out what equipment might be worth salvaging versus what goes to scrap. Take photos of the HVAC units, the fire suppression panels, the electrical rooms. Write a report. Go home. That was the job. I've been a building automation technician for 11 years. Before this mall, I'd done hospitals, data centers, a few university campuses, a downtown hotel that got converted to condos. You learn to see buildings differently when you do this work. Most people walk into a space and see the surfaces, the floors, the walls, the displays in the windows. I walk in and see the bones, the ductwork above the ceiling tiles, the pipe chases running up through the walls, the mechanical rooms that nobody visits except maintenance guys, the stuff that keeps a building breathing. Eastgate Crossing Mall had been half dead for 3 years before the wrecking crew got the contract. A Sears anchor store closed, then a JCPenney, then the movie theater on the south end. What was left when I came in was a dollar store, a Foot Locker, 2 phone repair kiosks, a food court with 4 operating vendors out of 12 possible slots, and a sad little indoor carousel that still worked but had no children riding it, because there were no children coming here anymore. Maybe 100 customers on a good Saturday. The parking lot held 3,000 cars. They were using a fraction of 1 corner. I got there on a Monday morning, late October. The property manager, guy named Preston, soft handshake, smelled like he'd had coffee for breakfast and lunch, gave me a key card, a set of paper blueprints that were already outdated by 2 renovations, and a verbal warning that the freight elevator on the north side was unreliable. Then he left. He had, I think, 4 other properties he was managing from the same office. The mall was already dead to him on paper. He just needed my report to close out the asset file. The building had 3 levels. Ground floor was retail. Second floor was more retail plus the food court, which occupied a central atrium position above a skylight. Third level was management offices, storage, and the mechanical penthouse where the main air handling units lived. Below ground was a loading dock area, connected to a service tunnel that ran under the north parking lot to a receiving station out by the road. I didn't know about that tunnel on the first day. I found out about it later, and that detail, that one structural detail nobody mentioned in the briefing, is the only reason I'm able to write this at all. I spent the first day mapping systems. The BAS here was old, a Johnson Controls Metasys installation from around 2004, with some patched-in additions from maybe 2011 when they did the roof replacement. The software interface was the kind that makes your eyes dry out just looking at it. Green text on a dark background, alarm logs going back years, half the sensor points showing communication faults, because whoever was supposed to maintain this hadn't been maintaining it. I connected my laptop, started pulling data, found that 3 of the main air handling units were running at partial capacity, and 1 had been offline for 6 months, with a seized fan motor that nobody had replaced. I was in the mechanical penthouse when I first heard something weird on the radio. I had a little Bluetooth speaker running, just background noise while I worked. Local news station. I wasn't paying much attention. It was all traffic and weather, and a segment about some local high school football team. Then the anchor said something about an incident at a hospital on the east side of the city. A cluster of patients in the ER behaving aggressively. Some kind of reaction to a drug interaction, they were saying. Police were called. 2 officers were bitten. I remember stopping what I was doing and looking at the speaker for a second, like the speaker had said something rude. Bitten, not struck or attacked, bitten. Then the anchor moved on to weather, and I moved on to the broken fan motor, and the day continued. That was Monday. Tuesday, the property manager called me midday to ask how the survey was going. I told him 2 days minimum, maybe 3. The system logs were extensive, and some of the sensor wiring was going to need documentation that wasn't in the original drawings. He said fine, take whatever time I needed, but try to wrap before Friday. There was a township meeting about the demolition timeline, and he needed the report to present. The news was different on Tuesday. Not just that one hospital now. 3 hospitals in the metro area were reporting the same kind of incidents. People in the ER for other reasons were being attacked by other patients. The word they kept using was erratic behavior. They were very careful about that. Erratic behavior. Not the patients were eating each other, which is what I later understood was happening, but erratic behavior, because the people writing the news copy were still in that phase where they believed their own careful language would somehow contain what was coming. I watched a clip on my phone during lunch, sitting in the food court. A cell phone video, shaky as hell, shot in what looked like a hospital corridor. I couldn't make out much. People running. Someone on the floor. A sound that I can only describe as wet and wrong. The clip was already being shared with titles like, "Crazy Hospital Fight Video," and "Is This Real?" And the top comment was something like, "This is obviously staged." The food court lady who made my chicken wrap, older woman, name tag said Ruth, was watching something on her own phone behind the counter. She looked up at me and said, "You hearing about this hospital stuff?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "My nephew works at County General. He called this morning, said they've been on lockdown since last night." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and ate my wrap. By Tuesday evening, the news was running it as the lead story. Not buried in the health segment, the actual lead. 6 hospitals now. The mayor was going to give a statement. The CDC was monitoring the situation. Somebody had started using the phrase, unusual infection, and that phrase was everywhere, running through the lower thirds of every news channel like a river. Unusual infection. Unusual infection. As if unusual was doing enough work in that sentence. As if that little word was big enough to cover what it was actually standing in front of. I drove home, made dinner, tried to sleep. The city outside my apartment window sounded different. More sirens than usual. That could have been anything. I told myself it was anything. Wednesday, I drove back to the mall. There were fewer cars in the parking lot. The dollar store was closed. Gate pulled down. No note. Just dark inside. One of the food court vendors, a pizza place, had a handwritten sign on the counter that said, "Closed until further notice." The carousel was still running, still playing its thin mechanical music, still empty. Preston texted me mid-morning. "Management has decided to keep normal operations for now. Please continue your work." I was in the second-floor corridor near the old Sears space, photographing a VAV box that was stuck in a fixed position, when I heard a commotion below on the ground floor. Not a fight exactly, more like a crowd sound. The kind of noise a group of people makes when they're all individually afraid and starting to communicate that fear to each other through proximity. A kind of collective hum that rises. I went to the railing and looked down. Maybe 40 people on the ground floor. Some of them were standing still, staring at their phones. Some were moving toward the exits. A security guard, fat guy in a dark blue uniform whose name I later found out was Gerald, though that information came too late to do either of us any good, was standing near the main entrance holding a radio to his ear, not moving, just holding it there with an expression on his face that I recognized as the expression of a person who has just heard something they cannot process. I called Preston. He didn't pick up. I called the main management office number on the property documentation. Nobody answered. I went back to my laptop in the mechanical penthouse and tried to find news. The network in the building was spotty up there. It was always spotty up there. Buildings this old have dead zones all over the upper mechanical spaces. But I got enough signal to see that the city's emergency management page was now recommending people stay home, out of an abundance of caution, which is the phrase that bureaucrats use when what they actually mean is, "We don't know how bad this is yet, and we're trying not to create panic by telling you that." 6 counties under some kind of advisory. Hospitals overwhelmed. People were posting videos from all over, not just the east side now, all over. And these videos didn't look like hospital fights anymore. They looked like street footage, intersections, parking lots, a gas station where the cashier booth windows were broken and something dark was on the ground outside. I sat with my laptop in the mechanical penthouse, and I thought about leaving. I should have left. If I'd left right then, on Wednesday morning, I might have had a clear shot out. The highways were probably still moving. I could have gotten back to my apartment, grabbed some things, headed north toward my brother's place in the hill country. Instead, I went back down to finish documenting the 3rd air handling unit because I am, apparently, the kind of person who finishes what he started, even when the world is ending. By Wednesday afternoon, the mall was emptying out. Not all at once. People were leaving in 1s and 2s, drifting toward the exits, and nobody was replacing them. The Foot Locker pulled its gate and locked it. The remaining food court vendors closed up. Gerald, the security guard, disappeared around 2 p.m., and I never saw him again. I was alone in the building by around 3:30, or I thought I was. I found this out because I went to the management office suite on the 3rd floor to try the landline. There's always a landline in a management office. They're legally required to maintain them for fire safety communication. And I walked into a space that was clearly still occupied by someone who was not supposed to be there. Coffee cup, still warm. A sleeping bag rolled up under a desk. A few cans of food, corn, kidney beans, stacked against the wall. A backpack. I stood there in the doorway and looked at this setup and felt a very specific kind of chill that wasn't about the building's AC, which wasn't running properly anyway. Somebody had been living here, in the management offices, while the mall was supposedly closed. I knocked on the walls, called out hello, twice. Nothing answered. I figured whoever it was had left with the other people. I couldn't know that for sure, but it was the most reasonable assumption, and I had bigger things to worry about. I went to the landline, got a dial tone, called Preston again. This time it rang 7 times, and he picked up, and he sounded not okay. His voice had that flattened quality that people's voices get when they're running on no sleep and too much adrenaline. He said, "Garrett, yeah, listen, I'm getting calls from all the properties. I can't." I said, "Preston, what's happening out there? Should I leave?" He said, "I don't know. If you feel safe, maybe stay put for now. The highways are backed up. It's not good out there." He paused. "We're sending everyone home. The mall's officially closed as of today. You can go whenever you need to." Then he hung up. I looked out the management office window. It faced the parking lot, and from up here I could see the road beyond the lot. There were cars on it, moving slowly, some not moving at all. 2 cars had pulled onto the shoulder. I could see the highway on-ramp about a 1/4 mile away, and it looked like a parking lot. A thick, stopped line of vehicles going nowhere. And in the parking lot below me, near the south entrance, there was a person who wasn't moving right. I've tried to describe this to myself 100 times since. The way a person moves when something is wrong with them is hard to articulate because your brain knows immediately before you can put words to it. It's like how you know a car is about to swerve before it swerves. Some combination of speed and angle and rhythm that doesn't match any pattern your brain has filed under normal. This person was walking in circles, small, tight circles, near the south entrance doors. Their head was down. They were moving in a way that made no mechanical sense. All one side of their body seemed to lag behind the other, like a bad battery connection. I watched them for maybe 2 minutes. Then a second car pulled into the lot, and a woman got out, moving toward the south entrance, and the circling person stopped circling and went toward her. I stepped back from the window. I'm not going to describe what happened in the parking lot after that, because I couldn't see it all clearly from the 3rd floor, and what I could see, I'd rather not put into words. I'll just say that the woman who got out of the car started making sounds that I could hear through the glass, and those sounds, that specific pitch and quality, got filed in my brain in a place I've never been able to close off since. Some sounds just live in you. You can't choose where they go. I stepped back and stood in the middle of the management office and thought, I need to decide something right now. Not in 10 minutes, right now. The thing about being a building automation tech is that you spend a lot of time alone in buildings, and you learn very early that a building's security is mostly theater. Card access readers and security cameras and locked stairwells. They're designed to slow down someone who's confused or casual. They're not designed to actually prevent a determined effort. But slow down is enough, if the threat is slow. I went to the BAS terminal in the management office. It was the main head-end station, The point where everything in the building could be controlled from a single interface. Fire doors, HVAC zones, security gate positions, emergency lighting circuits. I'd been working with this terminal for 3 days. I knew where everything was. I pulled up the fire door schedule. The building had 22 rated fire doors at various points. Stairwells, corridor intersections, the loading dock access. In normal operation, they were held open by electromagnetic holders wired to the fire alarm system. Trip the fire alarm, power cuts to the holders, doors swing closed and latch. I didn't trip the fire alarm. That would have started a whole sequence I didn't want. Horn strobes, sprinkler pre-action, 911 auto dial to the fire department. Instead, I went into the override controls and individually cut power to each electromagnetic holder from the software. It took 23 minutes. Door by door, the building was physically large, but the network points were all mapped because I'd been mapping them all week. When I was done, every rated fire door in the building was closed and latched. All of them. The stairwells were sealed. The corridors between zones were sealed. Then I went through the security panel integration. The mall had an old Linnell access control system that was linked to the BAS for HVAC scheduling, and I set every card reader to deny all for exit mode, meaning the exterior doors, which all had card readers on the inside, would not release on a card swipe. They'd stay locked. The exterior doors were the standard retail grade stuff, aluminum frame, push bar exit hardware. They could be broken, but they wouldn't open easily, and they wouldn't open by accident. And in those early hours, easy and accidental was the level I was working against. I didn't know yet what I was actually working against. Not really. I thought, God help me. I actually thought this in those first hours. I thought maybe it was a bad flu. Maybe it was some kind of drug. I'd heard about bath salts making people act insane. I thought maybe this was a worse version of that. Something that would pass. It didn't pass. After locking the doors, I did the one thing that made the most practical difference that day. And it wasn't something tactical or clever. It was just that I went to every food court vendor storage room and took stock. 4 vendors had left their storage areas unlocked, probably in the rush to leave. One of them, the sandwich place, which was some kind of franchise I'd never heard of, had a walk-in cooler full of produce, bread, and deli meats. Another had dry goods in a back room. Bulk flour, sugar, canned beans, tomato sauce, boxes of pasta, cooking oil, cornstarch. The pizza place had a chest freezer with frozen dough and a lot of sauce. I wasn't thinking in terms of 90 days. I wasn't thinking in terms of days at all. I was just thinking, I don't know what's outside yet, and food in here is better than no food, and I should know what I have. That was day 0. That was how I started. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the management office with the lights off, listening to the sounds the building made. And buildings make a lot of sounds when you know them well enough to hear them. The HVAC cycling, the expansion and contraction of the metal ductwork as temperatures shifted. Somewhere on the lower level, a door I hadn't properly secured was drifting in a draft. I could hear it from 3 floors up, a slow tick-tick against its frame, like a clock that had lost its spring. Around midnight, I heard something from outside. Not from the parking lot side, but from the north side, where the loading dock was. A heavy sound, repeated. Something hitting the roll-up door. I sat very still and waited. It stopped after a while. The carousel music had been playing all evening. Nobody had thought to turn it off, and it ran on a timer. It shut off at 10 p.m. like it was programmed to, and the silence it left behind was something else. Day 1. Morning came in sideways through the skylights in the atrium, and I was awake to see it because I hadn't slept. I had 2/3 of a cold cup of coffee from the previous day, and I drank it while looking out the management office window at a parking lot that now had 7 abandoned cars in it, instead of the 3 that had been there last night. 3 of the cars had their doors open. I didn't see any people. The first thing I did that morning, after stretching my back, which had spent the night in a desk chair, was go through the management office properly. I mean really go through it. Every cabinet, every drawer. The person who'd been living here had left their supplies behind, which told me they'd left in a hurry. The backpack had a change of clothes, a portable phone charger, a multi-tool, some cash that was already meaningless, and half a bag of trail mix. The canned goods under the desk, 4 cans of corn, 2 of kidney beans, 1 of chickpeas, a jar of peanut butter that was about halfway gone, a box of crackers. Someone had been careful. Someone had been planning to stay here a while, or had already been staying a while. Under the desk, tucked behind the sleeping bag, there was something that took me a minute to understand. A notebook, spiral-bound, with a combination lock looped through the wire. Someone had locked their journal. The lock was a cheap 3-digit thing, and I sat there for a while trying different combinations. 000, 111, 123, 321. And none of them worked, and I decided it wasn't worth the effort, and put it aside. I'd come back to it, that was the thought. I'd come back to it. I spent most of day 1 doing a proper survey of the building as it currently stood, not as a building automation technician, but as a person who needed to understand what he was working with. Different kind of walkthrough. I wasn't looking for sensor points and equipment schedules anymore. I was looking at doors, windows, structural weak spots. I was looking at what was behind me, and above me, and below me. Ground floor. The main retail corridor ran east-west, with cross corridors at regular intervals. The exterior walls were mostly glass on the east and west faces. Big display windows that had been there since the mall opened in 1987. The north face was more solid, mostly brick with smaller windows, because the loading dock was on the north side. The south face had the main entrance, which was all glass and aluminum storefront construction. Beautiful from an aesthetic standpoint, terrible from a containment standpoint. Second floor, the food court atrium was the center, with retail spaces radiating out. The food court level was better. Less glass on the exterior, more interior-facing windows that looked down into the atrium or out over the parking lot from a higher angle. The service corridors behind the food court vendors were separate from the public space, connected to the back-of-house stairs and a service elevator. Third floor, management, storage, mechanical. This is where I set up. The management office suite was a connected series of rooms, a reception area, a conference room, a few private offices, a break room with a small kitchen that had a sink, microwave, and coffee maker. There was also a storage room full of Christmas decorations, old marketing materials, 3 broken chairs, and a very dead plant. Mechanical penthouse, the roof level, accessed from the 3rd floor by a locked stairwell. 4 main air handling units, 2 cooling towers, a bank of electrical distribution panels, the connection point for the building's natural gas service, and this was the piece I'd noted in my original survey, but hadn't fully appreciated yet, a large flat roof section with a perimeter parapet wall that was about 18 inches high. The roof was covered in the standard EPDM rubber membrane, with drainage scuppers at the low points. Rain falls on roofs. Water collects in low spots. This became important later. I took notes. I drew rough floor plans on the back of one of the old marketing brochures I found in the storage room. Big, glossy things advertising the mall's grand reopening, from whenever they'd last tried to rebrand. The cheerful fonts looked surreal by that point. I drew over them without guilt. By late afternoon, I had a clearer picture of what I was dealing with, structurally. The good news. The loading dock on the north side had a solid roll-up door made of steel slats, plus a secondary personnel door beside it that was a proper commercial steel door with a mortise lock. The main entrance on the south was the weak point, aluminum framing and glass, not designed to stop anything with determination. But in front of the main entrance, there was a security gate, the kind of scissor-pattern metal gate you see in malls everywhere, designed to close across the entrance during after hours. I closed it manually, using the release handle in the management office BAS panel. It wasn't designed as a structural barrier exactly, but it was something. The windows on the ground floor retail spaces were plate glass, floor to ceiling in most spots. There wasn't much I could do about those in the short term. What I could do was make sure the interior fire doors stayed closed, so even if someone or something broke through a window, they'd still be contained to that retail zone. The loading dock was my biggest concern. That second sound I'd heard the night before, the heavy, repeated impact against the roll-up door, hadn't gone away. During my day 1 survey, I went down to the loading dock level, which was below the main floor and accessed by an interior stairwell that I could lock. I listened at the stairwell door for a while before I went through. What I heard on the other side of the roll-up door was, "Look, I want to be accurate here, not dramatic." It was a dull, irregular impact, like someone leaning against the door and then pulling away and leaning again, over and over. Not frantic, not urgent, just persistent. The way a branch will tap against a window in the wind for hours. I didn't open the door. The roll-up door itself was solid. The slat construction was steel, and the bottom bar had a proper floor-locking mechanism that I engaged from the inside. It wasn't going anywhere unless someone had a vehicle to ram it, but the personnel door next to it, that was a concern. The lock was a standard mortise lock with a key cylinder, and I didn't have the key. What I had was a collection of keys from the management office key cabinet, and none of the labels made any sense. I tried keys for about 15 minutes, standing in front of that door, listening to the irregular impact sounds from the other side of the roll-up, until I found one that fit, turned the deadbolt. The door was already locked, but I turned it again, just to feel it move. Then I went upstairs and didn't come back down to the loading dock for 2 days. Day 1 felt very long. There's a specific quality to time when you're the only person in a large building, doing something you're making up as you go. There's no rhythm to anchor to, no meetings, no schedule, no other person's presence to set the clock against. You eat when you remember to. You lose track of hours. The building itself becomes the only timepiece. The shift of light through the skylights. The cycling of the HVAC, which I kept running on reduced capacity, because the compressors were old and I wanted to keep them from burning out. I ate pasta with canned tomato sauce that night, cooked on a hot plate I found in the management break room. Hot plate was one of those things that was just there, left behind by some office worker years ago. 2 of the 4 burner coils worked. That was enough. I couldn't get signal on my phone in the management offices. The building was blocking everything. On the roof I got 1 bar, enough to load web pages very slowly. What I saw on those web pages was enough to stop me from making any plans that involved the road. The city wasn't handling it. The city wasn't handling anything. That was clear from the 20 different local news sites I tried to load. Half of them had stopped updating entirely. The ones that were still posting were reporting. I don't know how to say this without it sounding like the thing from movies, but there it is. A complete breakdown of the normal order of things. Hospitals were gone. Police were not responding to most calls. The governor had declared something, but the declaration itself was already 24 hours old, and the situation had moved well past whatever the declaration was designed to address. I sat on the roof in the dark with 1 bar of signal and read these things and felt, not panic, which surprises me when I think about it. I felt a kind of settling, like something had just been confirmed that I'd already known on some level, and now I could stop hoping it was wrong and just deal with what was real. What was real? I was in a building. The building was, for the moment, secure. I had food for maybe 2 to 3 weeks at current consumption levels if I was careful. I had water from the building's utility connection for as long as the city kept pressure on the mains, which might not be long. I had electrical power from the grid for as long as the grid held. Ditto. I had building automation tools, mechanical knowledge, and 3 years' worth of an old school's fire safety code in my head. What I didn't have, any plan beyond the next day. The second thing I didn't have, any idea whether I was going to try to leave or try to stay. And that question, leave or stay, was the one that sat at the back of everything for the next 2 weeks, like a stone in my shoe. Every day I thought, today might be the day I try to get out. And every day I didn't, for reasons that kept shifting. Day 2. Water. City water pressure dropped noticeably that morning. Not gone, but low. When I turned on the break room tap, it came out slow and without the usual confidence. I filled every container I could find. Water bottles from the vendors' storage rooms, buckets from the janitorial closet, the big steam table pans from the sandwich vendor's kitchen. I even filled the break room sink and put plastic bags over the drains to keep it from evaporating. Then I went to the roof and looked at the drainage system. The flat roof had 3 low points, each with a 4-inch drain that led to the building's internal downspout system. The scuppers on the parapet wall were the overflow path. Those went directly to the exterior. In a normal building operation, you want rain to go away from the building as fast as possible. Drainage was designed to move water out. I needed to move water in, or at least collect it before it moved out. I spent most of day 2 blocking the roof drains. I used rubber bungs from the janitorial supply room, the same kind used to plug floor drains during cleaning, and I wedged them into the drain openings as tight as I could get them. Then I found the 6 largest containers I could manage to carry up the mechanical penthouse stairs. 2 50-gallon galvanized trash cans from the janitorial room. 3 large rolling mop buckets. 1 old Hayfac condensate collection pan that was about 3 feet square and dented but watertight. I put these at the low points. It wasn't going to rain that day. The sky was clear and cold. But I knew it would rain eventually. October in this part of the country. Rain is not an if, it's a when. I was playing a long game I hadn't consciously decided to play yet, but my hands were already playing it. The city water went to a trickle by mid-afternoon and was completely gone by evening. I had roughly 30 gallons of stored water at that point. Not enough for weeks. Enough for several days if I was very careful. I also did something that day that felt slightly insane, but turned out to be one of the better decisions I made in those first weeks. I went through the entire second-floor food court and collected every drink in every vendor refrigerator that hadn't been plugged in. Sodas, bottled water, juices, sports drinks. Stacked them all in the management office storage room. It wasn't hydration in any efficient sense. The sugar load from a sustained soda diet would be its own problem. But it was liquid, and liquid was the thing I was suddenly most aware of needing. Late that afternoon, I heard something from the ground floor. Not from outside, from inside the building. A door. Not the sound of a door being broken through. The sound of a door moving on its hinges. A slow, squealing swing. The kind that buildings make when drafts move through them. One of the fire doors, somewhere on the ground floor, wasn't fully latching because of a warped frame or an old latch mechanism. I knew this. I'd noticed several during my survey, but hearing it now, in the quiet of an empty building, with the knowledge of what was outside pressing on everything, it was a different sensation. I stood in the corridor outside the management suite and listened. The door swung and settled and swung again. Just draft, just a building breathing. I went down to the ground floor anyway, moving slowly, staying close to the walls in the interior corridors. I found the door. It was in the east retail corridor, near the old Sears space, and the latch mechanism was indeed worn. I propped a metal chair under the handle and wedged it shut. Not elegant. Better than nothing. On the way back up, I passed the display windows on the east face of the building and made myself look outside. There were 11 of them in the parking lot. I counted. 11 people who were not moving like people, distributed across the lot in no pattern I could understand, not clustered around anything, not moving toward anything, just occupying space in the loose way that objects occupy space when nobody's arranging them. 3 of them were pressed against the east glass, facing it. Looking in, you'd think, except that looking implies something purposeful. These were not looking. They were just oriented toward the glass, like compass needles pointing at something they couldn't explain. I stood back from the window, far enough that I was in shadow, and watched them for a long time. They moved, but not much, and not far. Slow circles, weight shifting. One of them made a sound I felt in my chest more than heard. Then a noise came from somewhere, a car alarm, a few blocks away, 2 short beeps, like someone was unlocking their car from a distance, and 8 of the 11 in the parking lot turned toward it simultaneously, like dogs hearing a whistle. They moved toward the sound, not fast, but all at the same time, without communicating, without deciding, just moved. The 3 still against the glass stayed where they were for another minute. Then one of them turned and followed the others, and the remaining 2 slowly drifted that way too. They were going after the sound. I stood in the interior shadow for a long time after that, very still, thinking about what I'd just seen, thinking about the sound my shoes made on the tile when I walked, thinking about the distance between the floor I was standing on and the parking lot below, and whether glass was thick enough, and whether the HVAC vents that moved air in this building also moved sound. A lot to think about. I thought about it quietly. Days 3 through 5. I need to say something about the smell. By day 3, the mall had a specific quality to its air that it hadn't had when I arrived. Part of this was the food court. With the coolers unpowered and the meat and produce in there warming up, the decay was already starting. A slow, sour rising that came up through the air handling system, which I couldn't filter out without running the units at a setting that would have been too noisy. I compromised, ran them at a lower speed setting that kept some air moving without the fan noise being as loud, and opened the management office windows, small windows, hinge type, high on the wall, to bring some outside air in. That helped with the food court smell. It introduced a different smell, from outside, which I won't describe except to say that by day 3, outside smelled different than it had before, and that difference became the permanent backdrop to everything that followed. Day 3 I spent on 2 things: proper inventory and generator assessment. The inventory took most of the morning. I went through every storage room, every unlocked cabinet, every vendor back room methodically. Made a list, paper, pen, from the management office supplies. What I had: food court storage, roughly 80 pounds of dry pasta and rice combined, about 40 cans of various vegetables and beans, 60 pounds of frozen bread dough. This would become waterlogged once the freezers died, which would happen once grid power went. 4 gallons of cooking oil, 3 10-pound bags of flour, 2 of sugar, salt in a commercial container, probably 10 pounds, commercial-size containers of various spices, packets of instant coffee, more than I'd ever need, a flat of 36 granola bars from the sandwich vendor's snack display, a flat of protein bars, 1 case of cup noodles, 24 units, condiments in bulk, ketchup, mustard, hot sauce. In the management office, the supplies from the person who'd been squatting here: trail mix, peanut butter, crackers, canned goods, plus a reasonable office supply kit, which sounds useless, but included tape, scissors, markers, a ruler, and about 400 sticky notes that I'd end up using as a calendar system. Sports drinks and sodas from the vendor refrigerators, maybe 60 liters total. Bottled water, about 40 liters. Stored tap water in various containers, roughly 30 gallons. Tools in my work bag: laptop, cables, a multimeter, a pair of channel lock pliers, a flathead and Phillips screwdriver, a headlamp. In the janitorial room, a full mop cart, cleaning chemicals, a box of trash bags, a folding stepladder, a cordless drill from some repair job that had been left behind, 1 spare battery for it that was about half charged. The cordless drill was a find. Not because I needed to drive screws immediately, but because a cordless drill in a building with no power to spare is a reminder that tools matter. And what else was there? First aid kit from the management office wall. Basic. Band-aids, gauze, antiseptic, some over-the-counter painkillers. Not enough for anything serious. The generator was in the basement mechanical room, separate from the loading dock area. A 150 kilowatt diesel standby unit. The kind that's designed to power emergency lighting and life safety systems when the grid goes down. It had a day tank, with maybe 100 gallons of diesel already in it. The main diesel storage tank, which fed the day tank through a transfer pump, was in the parking lot, underground, a 1,000-gallon buried tank. That tank was for the generator. It was separate from any gas station infrastructure, just the mall's own emergency power supply. I checked the generator on day 3. The battery for the starting system was a little weak, but not dead. The engine turned over when I hit the manual start button. It ran rough for 30 seconds. Smoothed out, ran clean. I let it run for 5 minutes just to feel it, to confirm that it would start again when I needed it, then shut it down. I was conserving that diesel like it was blood. Day 4 I did something I'd been putting off. I went back up to the roof, properly, with my laptop bag, and spent several hours up there in the weak October sun, trying to get internet access through whatever signal I could catch. I had 1 bar on my phone's data. Sporadic. I used the laptop's Wi-Fi to try to connect to anything available. There were several residential networks broadcasting from the neighborhoods west of the mall parking lot. none of them with a strong enough signal to actually load pages. My phone's hotspot was the only thing that worked, and only barely. What I found, the situation was not getting better. Nationally, same thing as locally, scaled up. The phrases being used were evolving from unusual infection to outbreak to, in some more honest reporting, collapse. The government was still sending communications, emergency alerts, text messages, radio broadcasts, but the communications were becoming simpler as time went on, which is never a good sign. Simple commands. Stay indoors. Do not approach infected individuals. Avoid large gatherings. I'd left the city ahead of anyone's formal instructions. Accidentally, yes. Accidentally counts. What I was most looking for, and couldn't find any useful information about, was the mechanism. How does this spread? Is it only bites, or is there airborne transmission? How long between infection and change? These questions weren't being answered in the public reporting, either because nobody knew yet, or because telling people would create more panic than it prevented. I decided to operate as if it was bite only, because that was the version that made my current situation viable. If it was airborne, I was already dead, and there was no plan worth making. So, bite only, until proven otherwise. Day 5, I heard the human voice. Not from outside, from inside the building. I was in the second-floor food court, eating lunch. Cup noodles, which had become my primary food for days I was too preoccupied to cook properly, when I heard, from somewhere below me, a voice, a person's voice, saying words I couldn't make out from that distance. I froze, noodles half raised, listened. It came again, a voice, definitely, not a recording, not the building's PA system, which I disconnected on day 2, a person, somewhere on the ground floor, speaking. I set the cup down very carefully, stood up without scraping the chair, and moved to the stairwell. The thing about the voice. I should explain the acoustic situation in this building, because it matters. The atrium design, open second floor with the food court looking down into a first floor open space, meant sound traveled in strange ways. Someone talking on the ground floor of the atrium could sometimes be heard more clearly on the second floor than they'd be heard 10 feet away at their own level. Conversely, sound from the food court could carry downward in certain weather conditions, certain pressure zones. The building breathed sound differently depending on time of day and whether the HVAC was running. What I was hearing was coming from the northeast corner of the ground floor. That area was the only part of the mall I hadn't thoroughly explored. It was the corridor that led to the old movie theater on the south end, which I'd physically been in but hadn't spent much time searching because the theater was a large, empty space with no supplies of interest. But between the food court and the theater, there was a short retail corridor with 3 vacant storefronts. I went down the service stairs instead of the main atrium stairs, came out in the back-of-house corridor behind the food court vendors, moved through to the east service door, and came into the ground floor retail corridor from the back side. The voice had stopped by the time I got close. I stood in the corridor and listened. Then, about 20 feet ahead of me, one of the vacant storefront doors opened. Not broke open. Opened. Someone had unlocked it from the inside. A man came out, 50s, heavy through the shoulders, wearing a mall custodian's uniform, the gray pants and blue shirt that I recognized as the Eastgate Crossing maintenance staff outfit, because I'd seen it in the staff photos on the management office bulletin board. He was holding a mop handle, not like a weapon, just holding it. He looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. His name was Walter Briggs, 31 years with the property, the longest tenured maintenance employee in the building's history, a fact he told me about 20 minutes later, with the same flat affect he used to tell me everything. He lived here, not squatting, lived here. His apartment had been 2 miles away, and when the situation started developing, he hadn't gone there. He'd come to work instead, worked the night shift, let himself into the building, decided the mall was safer than his apartment building, which had 32 other units and thin walls. The sleeping bag in the management office had been his. He'd moved down to the vacant storefront when the management staff left, because the storefront had no windows on the exterior. It was an interior-facing space with a display window looking into the main corridor. He'd felt more secure there. He was the one who'd been living on the canned corn and kidney beans. The locked journal was his. I gave it back without asking what was in it. Walt was not, it turned out, a person with a lot to say. In the weeks that followed, I learned his communication style. Efficient, practical, slightly impatient with anything that wasn't directly task-related. He didn't want to talk about his family, a sister in another state, no contact established since the outbreak. Didn't want to speculate about how long it would last or what was happening in the world. Didn't want to discuss feelings of any kind. What he wanted to do was work. In terms of pure survival value, Walt Briggs was worth more than 10 of me. He knew this building the way I know building systems in the abstract. He knew this building, specifically, in physical detail. He knew which loading dock bolt was stripped and how to make it hold anyway. He knew which roof drain had been partially blocked before I got there, and why. He knew that the third-floor bathroom on the east side had a pipe that froze in cold weather, and that I needed to keep the heat in that corridor above 52 degrees, or we'd have a burst situation. He knew where the spare parts for the plumbing fixtures were stored. He'd been making this building work for 31 years. He also knew about the delivery tunnel, but he didn't tell me about that on day 5. He told me about it much later, when it became the only thing left to talk about. Days 6 through 14. Walt and I worked out a split in about 30 seconds on day 6 morning, without much formal discussion. I handled the building systems, power management, HVAC, anything that touched the automation panels. He handled the physical infrastructure, doors, locks, pipes, drains, anything structural. We overlapped in a few areas and managed to avoid each other's toes without trying particularly hard. Two people who are both used to working alone will either clash immediately or figure out a wordless division of space pretty fast. We figured it out. The first joint project was the south entrance. The glass and aluminum storefront construction on the south face was still my biggest structural anxiety. The scissor security gate I'd closed from the BAS panel on day 0 was good, but it wasn't designed for what I was now imagining using it for. Walt took one look at it and said, "I've got steel bar stock in the maintenance room. We can pin the gate into the floor channels and weld the pivot points." I said, "I don't have a welder." He said, "I do." The maintenance room on the basement level, separate from the generator room, separate from the loading dock, had a portable stick welder, old Lincoln electric unit, probably 1990s, heavy as hell, ran on 220-volt power. The building had 220, still coming in. Because the grid was still partially up, I'd been monitoring it on the electrical panels, watching the voltage fluctuate, waiting for it to fail. It hadn't failed yet. Walt welded. I held things. It took most of the afternoon. When we were done, the scissor gate was pinned to the floor track at 6 points, and the pivot mechanism was fused solid. It wouldn't roll back. It was now a fixed barrier, not a gate. Not airtight, not bulletproof, but the structural integrity was real. A person could still get through the gaps if they were determined, but the kind of slow, weight-driven pressure I'd been watching in the parking lot wouldn't move it. We did the same thing to the east and west secondary entrances over the next 2 days. On day 7 it rained. It rained for almost 6 hours, the kind of steady October rain that isn't dramatic, just persistent. I watched the roof from the mechanical penthouse window. The rubber membrane channeled water toward the low points, and the blocked drains held. Water collected. By the time the rain stopped, I had about 40 gallons of rainwater pooled on the roof in the containers I'd set up, plus another 10 or so standing in the blocked drain depressions. Walt rigged a gravity feed system. He found 100 feet of half-inch flexible tubing in the maintenance room, the kind used for HUNVAC condensate drains, and ran it from the low point of the roof down through a service penetration into the top floor ceiling space, and from there down to a 55-gallon drum he'd found in the receiving area. The drum was clean inside, had been used for evac chemicals, had a bung on the side. He flushed it 3 times with the water we were already storing, and then the roof drain fed directly into it. Not a fast system, not a system that would handle a major rain event without the drum overflowing. But for steady rain over hours, we got water. I started sleeping better after day 7. Not because anything was better outside. If anything, outside was getting steadily worse. From the roof I could see smoke in 3 different directions, and the night sky had a quality I'd never seen before, a kind of flat orange glow over the city to the east that never went dark. But inside the building I had water and food and walls. The specific anxiety of, this could all fall apart today, had receded a little, replaced by a longer-term anxiety that was somehow more manageable. At least it wasn't immediate. Day 9, the grid went down. Not gradually, not flickering, just off. Instant, complete. Every powered thing in the building stopped at once. The HVAC units, the emergency exit signs, the remaining refrigerators, the break room coffee maker. Total darkness in the interior spaces. Daylight only through the skylights and the display windows. I'd known it was coming. I'd been watching the voltage data on the electrical panel. It had been sagging for 2 days. I went to the generator. The day tank had about 90 gallons of diesel. I'd calculated the generator's consumption rate at about 4 gallons per hour at full load. At a third of that, running emergency lighting, the break room appliances, and 1 HVAC unit instead of all 4, maybe 1.5 gallons per hour. 90 gallons at 1.5 gallons per hour was 60 hours. Less than 3 days. The main tank in the parking lot had 1,000 gallons. The problem was the transfer pump that moved diesel from the main tank to the day tank ran on building power. Building power was now off. The generator was running on the day tank. To refuel the day tank from the main tank, I needed to run the transfer pump. The transfer pump needed power to run. The generator was providing some power, but the transfer pump circuit was on the utility power bus, not the emergency bus, and I'd need to rewire it. I spent day 10, mostly, rewiring the transfer pump circuit. Walt held the flashlight. I rerouted the transfer pump to a 240-volt outlet on the emergency bus in the generator room. It took me most of the day because I kept having to double-check my work. A wiring mistake in this situation could kill the generator entirely, and a dead generator in October in a building without any other heating source would be its own kind of crisis. I was not fast. I was careful. Day 10 at 9 p.m., the transfer pump ran. The day tank refilled to full. 1,000 gallons in the main tank, minus what had gone into the day tank. Call it 940 gallons remaining. At reduced load, that was somewhere between 600 and 650 hours of generator runtime. 26 days, roughly. That was not enough to last indefinitely, but it was enough to matter. Day 11. I did something I'd been avoiding. I went to the ground floor to assess the situation properly. Not just from a distance. Not looking down from the second floor railing. All the way down, onto the ground floor, to look at the exterior from close range, through the retail windows. Walt came with me. He brought the mop handle. I brought nothing, which felt like a statement. The ground floor was in a state I can describe by saying it felt abandoned, rather than damaged. Nothing had broken in here. Nothing had been touched. The displays were still up in the store windows. Mannequins in Foot Locker sweatshirts. A promotional banner for some sale that had ended weeks ago, in a world that no longer existed to notice. A little promotional carousel of cheap cell phone cases, sitting on a kiosk in the middle of the corridor, spinning slightly in the draft from wherever draft came in at ground level. Things where people had left them. We went to the east face, the display windows, and looked out. The parking lot had changed. There were more of them, significantly more. I counted 23 in the visible portion of the east lot, and I could see the north edge of the lot from this angle too, where there were at least another dozen. They were distributed with that same patternless quality I'd observed from above. Not a crowd, not gathered around any point, just occupying space. A few were pressed against the building. 2 were against the east display glass, close enough that I could see the details of their faces through the window, which I won't write down, because some things are just for me. They can't open anything, Walt said beside me. Not a question, a reminder. No, I'd been watching them for 2 weeks at that point. Not once had I seen one of them try a door handle. Not once had I seen one look at a lock or a hinge or figure out a barrier by examining it. They pressed against solid things. They moved toward sound. That was the full extent of their interaction with the physical environment. But they break glass if there's enough pressure, I said, because I'd seen that too. From the upper floor. A large enough group pressing against a window could break it eventually. Not through intent, just through weight and persistence. We went back upstairs. We didn't discuss it further. We both understood what it meant. Day 12. Walt showed me a thing that changed our strategy for the next month. In the back corridor behind the food court, there was a door I'd catalogued on my original survey as mechanical access, boiler room, unused, and filed away without examining closely because the building didn't have a boiler. It had chilled heated water from an external plant, a system I'd documented. Walt took me to that door and opened it. It wasn't a boiler room, it was a secondary storage room, probably converted at some point in the building's history, and it was full of stuff. The previous management team, it turned out, had been using this room to store merchandise, left over from failed vendor contracts. When a vendor left a space without paying final fees, management sometimes retained inventory as partial recovery. There were boxes of merchandise in here. Shoes, 12 boxes of various sizes and styles from the Foot Locker liquidation, sporting goods, backpacks, water bottles, small camping equipment, the kind you find at a mid-level sporting goods kiosk. Nothing serious. Books from a former bookstore tenant, hundreds of them, stacked in banker's boxes, and, most usefully, a section of shelving with emergency preparedness items. The emergency preparedness items appeared to be from some kind of vendor who'd tried to sell prepper supplies in the mall for a few months before closing. What remained? 12 water purification straw filters, 20 boxes of emergency candles, 6 hand-crank flashlights with AM/FM radio, 4 emergency thermal blankets, 2 cases of freeze-dried camp food, 12 pouches each, and a hand-cranked water filter pump. The water filter pump and the purification straws were meaningful finds. Rainwater collected from a rubber roof and sitting in a galvanized drum for days is not necessarily clean. I'd been nervous about it. The filter pump changed that. Day 13. I made a proper calendar. Sticky notes, the 400 I had from the management office supplies, 1 per day, in a grid on the management office wall. I put them up starting from day 1 and filled in what I could remember about each day. Not detailed notes, just the key things. Day 1, locked doors, took food inventory. Day 7, rain, collected 40 gallons. Day 9, grid down, generator running, and so on. Looking at it laid out like that, I noticed that I'd been here almost 2 weeks, and I still had more food than I'd estimated initially. I was eating less than I thought. The portion control wasn't deliberate. I wasn't hungry mostly. Stress does something to appetite, or maybe it was the cold. The building was holding at around 62 degrees interior since I'd reduced the HVAC load. And at 62 degrees, your body burns calories just maintaining itself, which should make you hungrier. But instead, something else happens. Something that I can only call the economy of survival, where your body and brain agree to stop wanting things they know aren't available, and the hunger signals just dim. Not gone, dimmed. Day 14. I heard something from the loading dock that was different from the usual impact sounds. It was a voice. Not from inside the building this time, from outside, through the steel roll-up door. Someone yelling. The first voice, from outside. I want to be clear about what I felt when I heard a human voice from outside the loading dock door on day 14, because it wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't relief. It wasn't the flood of, oh, thank God, I'm not alone. It was more complicated than that, and less comfortable. What I felt was something close to caution, not hostility, caution. The same thing you feel when a stray dog comes toward you and you can't tell yet if it's friendly. Something has happened, and your hand goes out, but your feet stay ready. I told Walt. He came down with me. We stood on the inside of the loading dock roll-up door and listened. A man's voice, hoarse, like someone who'd been shouting for a while before reaching us. Words coming out in bursts. Please, I know someone's in there. I can see the lights through the roof. I'm not sick. I can see someone's been in here. Walt looked at me. His expression was the same as always, which is to say not much. I said quietly. How does he know about the roof? Walt's eyes moved toward the ceiling. He was thinking the same thing. To see light through the roof, you'd have to be elevated, on top of a vehicle, or at a high angle from outside. The parking lot was flat, but the north side of the building, the loading dock side, backed up to a slight rise in the terrain, a landscaped berm that the designers had put there to screen the dock from the road. From the top of that berm, you could potentially see over the parapet wall to the mechanical penthouse windows, or from a truck. I said, softly, "Sir, how many people with you?" A pause, then, "Just me. I swear to God. There's nobody else. I've been out here for, I don't know, days. My car stopped on the interstate and I walked. I don't know where else to go." I looked at Walt. Walt said, "Could be lying." Could be. We were quiet for a moment. I said, "If I open this door and there's a problem, can we close it fast?" Walt had known this moment was coming, I think, because he'd already looked at the roll-up mechanism. "Fast enough," he said. I said to the door, "Move back from the door, 20 feet back." A shuffling sound outside, then silence. I looked at Walt. He cranked the roll-up door about 2 feet up from the floor, slow, the mechanism loud in the closed space of the loading dock. Both of us pressed to the sides, not in front of the opening. Outside was gray, cold November morning. Through the 2-foot gap I could see concrete and the base of the landscaped berm. One pair of shoes, sneakers, dirty. "That's all of me," the voice said, trying for humor and missing it by a mile. We let him in. His name was Owen. Owen Polk, 43 years old, former high school history teacher, left the city 5 days after the outbreak, when the school, where he'd been sheltering, burned down. He'd walked about 12 miles on the interstate shoulder before his knee gave out, got picked up by a passing truck that took him another 10 miles north, and had been moving on foot since, stopping at whatever structures he could get into. He'd tried 2 houses and a gas station on his way here. He didn't say specifically what happened at the gas station. His eyes went somewhere else when I mentioned it. He was thin, dehydrated, and had a gash on his forearm from a chain-link fence he'd climbed over that was about 3 days old and had crusted over without properly healing. He showed me the gash without my asking, which was the thing that made me trust him. Someone who'd been bitten wouldn't volunteer that the way he did. Casually, matter of fact, just showing me the damage. Walt cleaned and dressed the wound with the management office first aid kit. He did it without commentary, efficiently, with that same focused quietness he brought to everything. Owen ate a whole container of cup noodles and half a granola bar and fell asleep on the management office floor before we could ask him much of anything. We covered him with one of the emergency thermal blankets and left him there. Day 15 through 23. Having Owen change the math in a way I hadn't anticipated, and not just the food math. The food math was the obvious thing. We now had 3 people consuming instead of 2, which pushed up our consumption rate and pushed back our theoretical supply window. But I'd already been revising that estimate anyway, as I realized how much food we actually had. The dry goods in the food court storage, the pasta, the rice, the flour and oil, were substantial. With careful portioning and reasonable food rotation, I was now estimating weeks more than the initial 2 to 3 weeks I'd calculated on day 0. 6 weeks felt plausible. 8 if we were disciplined. Beyond that would require something active, foraging in the stores, which I'd been avoiding. The non-food math was harder to describe. It was about distribution of attention. With 2 people, Walt and I could maintain a loose watch without it ever feeling like watch duty. 1 person usually in the management office area, and 1 person doing something else, so the building always had some level of presence and awareness. 3 people meant real watch rotation. Owen, once he'd slept and eaten properly and could participate, turned out to be a good watcher, patient, observant, the kind of person who doesn't mind sitting with nothing to do, because they've learned, over years of teaching teenagers, how to wait without getting bored or anxious. He'd sit near a window with a book from the storage room's banker boxes and just exist there for hours, occasionally noting what he saw outside in a small notebook he'd been carrying. What he saw outside, in those first days. The number in the parking lot was rising. Not dramatically, not all at once, but a slow accretion. By day 16, there were close to 40 visible from the east face windows. By day 19, over 50. They were coming from the road, probably, moving north along what used to be the main commercial corridor through this part of the metro area. The mall was a large object on a flat lot, and it attracted them the way all large objects seem to attract them, not with any intelligence, just the physics of it. Something big is more likely to catch a wandering attention than something small. The fact that they were accumulating outside made any thought of exit feel more complicated. Day 18, the first close call. Walt had gone down to the loading dock level to check the diesel transfer pump. Something in the sound of it the night before had concerned him, a slight change in pitch that he wanted to look at while there was still daylight coming through the small fixed windows on the north wall down there. I was on the 3rd floor. Owen was doing his window watch. I heard it from the 3rd floor. A crash, not a subtle building noise. A full, heavy crash from somewhere below. Then Walt's voice, loud, not shouting for help, more of a single sharp expletive. And then nothing. I went down fast, no hesitation, and I probably wasn't as quiet about it as I should have been. Through the 2nd floor and down the service stairs to the basement corridor. The loading dock door was still closed. The personnel door beside it was closed. Walt was standing against the wall beside the personnel door, with the mop handle across his chest, in a position that looked like he was blocking the door with his body. His face was doing something complicated. He pointed up. I looked. The ventilation grill above the personnel door, a standard louvered return air grill, about 12 by 24 inches, had come loose at the top mounting screw and was hanging open on one side. Through the gap, I could see the duct space beyond it. And in the duct space, visible in the dim light from below, was a forearm. Not moving, just there. A human forearm in a gray sleeve, visible through the gap in the grill, hanging down into the duct space from somewhere further in. My first thought was a person, someone trapped in the ductwork. My second thought, arriving about half a second behind the first, was the return air ducts on the north face of the building connect to the outside air intake on the roof. And the outside air intake on the roof had a filter screen, but filter screens are not structural barriers. It hasn't moved, Walt said, very quietly. How long? Since I got here. I was reaching up to check the grill, just checking it. I'd noticed it was loose yesterday, and I pushed it, and it swung open, and it was just there. Like it had been there a while. Is it? I can't tell, he said. I can't see the rest of it. We looked at the arm for a while. It didn't move, but it was there, in the ductwork, which meant something had gotten through the air intake on the roof and gone, or been guided by the duct geometry, to this point in the return air system. The ductwork in this building was large enough, in several sections, to physically accommodate a human body. That was just the size of commercial evac ductwork. You have to be able to send technicians into it for maintenance. The intake screen on the roof was 12-gauge welded wire mesh, designed to keep birds out, not designed for anything with the weight and pressure that I was now thinking about. I need to go up to the roof, I said, and look at the intakes. Walt said, I'll stay here. I went up to the roof. The mechanical penthouse access door to the roof had a bolt lock on the inside that I'd been keeping engaged. I unbolted it and pushed the door open slowly. The roof was empty, no one on it. 4 air handling unit intake sections along the north parapet, each with a wire mesh screen over the outside face. 3 of the screens were intact. The 4th, Unit 3, the one whose fan motor had been seized when I first arrived, had the screen pulled loose at the bottom left corner. The mesh was bent outward, like something had pushed through it, or fallen against it. I got close to Unit 3's intake. The duct went straight down into the mechanical penthouse, connecting to the air handler casing, and from there, through the building's duct distribution system. Straight down. For something to have fallen in through the open screen, it would have to go straight down the duct, and then the duct geometry would carry it through the distribution system toward the return air section. I closed the screen. I had a roll of metal duct tape in my tool bag. Always carry metal duct tape. It's practically a mantra in this business. And I taped the screen perimeter to the casing. Not perfect. Better. I went back downstairs. The arm in the duct hadn't moved. I said to Walt, "I think it's stuck." "I think so too." We blocked the duct access with a piece of plywood from the maintenance room, screwed into the wall around the grill opening. Then we went upstairs and made dinner, and didn't talk about it for the rest of the evening. But I lay awake thinking about it. Thinking about the duct system in this building, which I knew from my original survey. The main supply ducts were too small for anyone or anything to get through. They narrowed down to branch sizes. But the return plenums, on the other 3 AHUs that were still operational, had intake screens that were old and might not be in perfect condition. The next morning, I went to every accessible intake screen on the roof and taped them all. Every seam, every edge. Metal duct tape, applied with the same attention I'd use on a fresh installation. A lot of tape. Worth it. Whatever had gotten into Unit 3's ductwork, and I have my theories, none of which I'm certain about, never came fully through into the building. When we eventually opened the duct panel on Unit 3's casing for a different repair purpose, about 3 weeks later, we found what we found, and closed it again, and didn't open it after that. I'm leaving that description out not because I want to be dramatic, but because some things are better not pictured. Day 20. Owen and I had our first real conversation. Up until then, it had been logistics, practical things, the vocabulary of the immediate situation. That night, after Walt had gone to sleep, he kept different hours than us, going to bed earlier and waking earlier. A lifelong habit he apparently had no intention of adjusting. Owen and I sat in the management office with one of the hand-crank flashlights burning low between us. Owen had found a crossword puzzle book in the banker boxes of the storage room. He was working through it with a pencil stub. I was eating the last of the peanut butter from the mystery squatter's supplies, the squatter being Walt, as we now knew, scraping the jar with a spoon methodically. "You think this is months or years?" Owen asked, not looking up from the crossword. "I don't know. Gut feeling." I thought about it. Months until I can safely move. Years until anything is back to what it was. I scraped the spoon around the jar. Maybe never for that last part. He wrote something in the crossword squares. Then, I was supposed to grade papers that Monday. The outbreak started on a Thursday, and by Monday, I'm still thinking about the stack of papers on my kitchen table. He paused. "That's embarrassing, looking back." I said, "It's not embarrassing. The brain keeps doing the thing it was doing." "Where were you when it started?" "Here. I was in the building already. Almost stayed. Almost left." "Why'd you stay?" I thought about the honest answer to that, which was, I'm not sure I made a decision at all. I made a series of smaller decisions that added up to staying, without ever making the overarching choice to stay. Closed the fire doors, took inventory, started the generator contingency, and by the time I'd done all that, leaving had become harder than staying. I was already here, I said, and I'd already done the work. Owen grunted. It might have been agreement, or it might have been a response to the crossword puzzle. With Owen, it was sometimes hard to tell. Day 22. The loading dock was breached. Not by what was outside, by what we did inside. Walt had been watching the diesel transfer pump, and the rate at which we were drawing down the main tank. His numbers matched mine. At current consumption, roughly 22 to 24 more days of generator runtime. After that, no power. No evac. No lighting beyond candles and hand-cranked flashlights. No water filter pump. He had an idea that he brought to me on day 21 evening. The loading dock, in addition to its roll-up door and personnel door, had a second access point that none of us had noticed because it was concealed behind a row of shelving units. A pass-through hatch, about 3 feet square, set into the exterior north wall at dock height, designed for receiving small deliveries without opening the main door. It had a steel cover, locked from the inside with a sliding bolt, and an outer cover on the exterior face that I'd noted during my original building survey, but classified as inactive because it was hidden behind shelving. Walt said there was a 200-gallon diesel tote, one of those intermediate bulk containers, a plastic cube inside a steel frame, in the receiving area on the other side of the building. It had been there when he started working here, years ago, part of some facility management project that was never completed. It was empty now, but if we could move it to the dock and run a fuel transfer hose through the pass-through hatch from the main tank in the parking lot, we might be able to pull additional diesel into the building. The main underground tank had a standard fill port and a vent pipe in the parking lot. The fill port had a cap on it. If we could get a hose to that fill port and get the other end of the hose inside, and get a pump going, or, simpler, get a siphon working, we could potentially increase our diesel reserve significantly. The problem was the north parking lot, not the south lot, where most of the accumulated infected were. The north side, the loading dock side, had fewer, maybe 10 to 15 in the visible area, but getting from the loading dock to the underground tank fill port meant going outside. Day 23. We tried it. I'm going to describe this carefully because the day had a lot of moving parts, and I want to get it right. We opened the pass-through hatch at 5:30 a.m. Earliest light, not quite dawn. Cold enough that our breath was visible. Through the hatch, from inside, I could see the north lot. 7 infected visible from that angle, all at various distances. None within 50 feet of the dock. Walt had cut 40 feet of half-inch flexible tubing from the HVAC condensate supply. I'd confirmed that the underground tank fill port was about 35 feet from the dock door. I'd measured it from the blueprint. The plan was simple. I go out through the personnel door, moving as quietly as possible, reach the fill port, insert one end of the hose, come back inside. Walt stays at the pass-through hatch and manages the other end. We try a gravity siphon first. The fill port is at ground level. The diesel tote inside is below ground level at dock height, so we might get flow by elevation differential alone. It took me 3 minutes outside. I want to be precise about this, because the 3 minutes felt like 30. The personnel door opened inward. I'd oiled the hinges the night before. It made no sound. I stepped onto the dock apron, in the cold air that smelled of, well, October, mostly. Dead leaves, and cold pavement, and something else that was becoming the permanent background to all outdoor air. But October more than anything. The concrete was frost-touched. My boots were the ones I'd been wearing since day 0. Heavy work boots, and they were quiet on the concrete if I placed them carefully. 7 infected. 3 of them were facing roughly north, away from me. 2 were against the east wall of the dock area, pressed against the brick, not moving at all, just standing, weight against the wall. 1 was moving slowly parallel to the north edge of the lot, drifting east. 1 was about 40 feet from the fill port, facing west. The one facing west was the issue. I moved along the dock apron, staying close to the wall, reaching the corner where the dock joined the main building structure. The fill port was in the concrete of the lot surface, a standard 4-inch capped fitting with a chain on the cap. I crouched down and reached for it. The cap was tight. I had channel lock pliers in my jacket pocket. I put them on the cap fitting and turned, slowly, and the cap broke free with a sound that I felt in my sternum. The infected facing west turned toward the sound. I stayed completely still, crouched over the fill port, with the cap in my left hand and the pliers in my right. It moved, 3 steps toward me, then stopped. I did not breathe for about 8 seconds. It turned slightly, not away, sort of sideways, like it had lost the direction of the sound. I exhaled very slowly through my nose. I put the hose in the fill port and made my way back to the personnel door along the wall. Went inside, closed the door, did not touch the handle after letting it latch. Controlled latch, 2 fingers, managing the click. Walt worked the other end of the hose through the pass-through hatch into the diesel tote. We waited. Gravity siphon didn't work. The elevation difference wasn't enough, or the resistance in 40 feet of half-inch tubing was too high. Nothing flowed. I went back to the generator room, found the small hand pump I'd noted earlier but hadn't brought into this plan, and we tried a manual pump. That worked, slowly. Pump, pump, pump at the indoor end, drawing diesel up through the hose, into the tote. We pumped for 90 minutes and transferred about 40 gallons. 40 gallons times 1.5 hours of generator time per gallon. Another 26 hours of run time. Worth it. We did this 3 more times in the following week. Different times of day, different conditions outside. The second time, one of the infected in the north lot was much closer to the fill port, and we waited 2 hours until it drifted away. The third time, it rained, and the sound of rain covered the cap removal completely, and we didn't worry about anything. The fourth time, something happened that changed the parameters. Day 28. The fourth diesel transfer was at dawn again. Cold, overcast. Walt had spotted only 4 infected on the north lot from the pass-through hatch, all at the far end. I went out through the personnel door. I was at the fill port, had just gotten the cap off, when I heard a sound from the direction of the road. A vehicle, running. Not an infected-related sound. An engine, a running car engine, getting louder, coming from the north. I flattened against the side of the building and did not move. The car came around the corner from the north service road. A sedan, dark blue, moving fast for the condition of the road, and went past the lot entrance without stopping. Gone in seconds. But those seconds were enough. The 4 infected on the north lot all snapped their attention toward the engine sound and moved, clumsily and fast at the same time, toward the road. All 4 of them in about 15 seconds, gone from the lot, following the sound. I stood against the building wall and watched the empty north lot and breathed. Someone was out there, someone alive, driving a car. More than 2 weeks after the grid went down, there were still living people moving through the area. I finished the fuel transfer and went inside and thought about what that meant for a long time. It meant things were not entirely gone. It meant the world outside was not just infected wandering in empty spaces. There were people, moving, adapting, going places. Some of those people might eventually find this mall. Some of them already had, indirectly. Owen had found us. And Owen was one person. But what about groups? I'd been operating as if the question of other survivors was theoretical. Owen was concrete proof it wasn't. The car on the road was further proof. People were out there, and the mall was a large, visible structure, and sooner or later more people were going to knock on the loading dock door. I needed to think about what I would do when that happened. Days 29 through 35. I spent a lot of day 29 thinking about what I didn't want. That sounds backwards. You'd think starting from what you want is more useful. But in this situation, with limited information about what was coming, starting from what I didn't want gave me clearer guardrails. I didn't want to turn people away to die. That was non-negotiable for me, and I made it non-negotiable early, before I had to make the actual decision, so I wouldn't renegotiate it in the moment under pressure. I also didn't want to let in a large group that would blow through our supplies in days and leave us all in a worse position. There's math to that concern, and it's real. What I thought would work, a slow filter. Assess each person or small group individually, take them in provisionally, let them prove themselves useful, integrate them before adding more. Keep the group small enough that the building's resources could actually support it. Walt, when I floated this to him, said, "Good luck deciding who's useful." Which was fair. Day 30. Owen found something in the storage room. He'd been going through the banker boxes of books methodically, partly for reading material and partly, this was classic Owen, because he was cataloging them, making a list of titles and subjects. He came to find me in the mechanical penthouse, where I was doing routine checks on the AHU operation, and said, "Do you know there are 3 first aid manuals in the book collection, and a wilderness medicine reference, and a field surgery guide?" I said no. He said, "The field surgery guide is from 1943, but it has the same information, worth reading." I said that was a good find. He said, "I've been reading the wilderness medicine one. The arm wound, his own arm, the chain link gash, healing well by now. I think I closed it wrong. It's healing a little tight, not infected, just tight." I looked at it. It was healed, mostly. A slight puckering that would probably loosen over time. I said it looked fine. "I'm going to learn the wound care section," he said, "in case it matters." That was Owen's way. Find a gap in the group's knowledge and fill it. He'd also already memorized the layout of every fire exit and could tell you the fastest route from any point in the building to any other point in about 10 seconds. Former teacher's instinct, know your room. Day 31, someone new arrived. This time from the south lot, which surprised me, because the south lot was where the majority of the infected had been accumulating. When Owen called me to the management office window, Urgent, quiet. I saw what had gotten through. A woman and a teenager. The woman was maybe late 30s, wearing a denim jacket over a fleece, moving low and fast across the parking lot, with one hand on the boy's sleeve. They weren't running. Running would have attracted attention. They were moving in that specific way you develop when you've been doing it for a while. Close to parked cars, using abandoned vehicles as cover, very deliberate about foot placement. The infected in the south lot were spread out, not dense, and most were facing the wrong direction. These two were threading through the gaps in a way that showed they'd done it before. They reached the south entrance. The scissor gate was there, welded shut, and beyond it the glass and aluminum storefront. They pressed against the frame, out of the sight lines of the infected behind them, and the woman looked up toward the building interior through the glass. I was at the management office window, 3 floors up, watching. She didn't see me, but she pulled something from her jacket pocket and held it up against the glass, facing inward. A piece of white cardboard. Marker letters. "We have medicine." I stared at that sign for a long time. I went down, taking the internal route through the service corridors to avoid making sound, and eventually positioned myself inside the south entrance area, on the other side of the gate from her, close enough to see her properly through the glass. She saw me then. Her face changed. Not relief exactly, more like a focused alertness, confirming something. I held up my own piece of paper. I'd grabbed a sheet from the office on the way down, marked with the one question that mattered most. "Bitten?" She shook her head, pointed at herself, pointed at the boy, shook her head again. The boy was watching me through the glass, with the very specific expression of a teenager who has learned to keep their fear on the inside. I let them in through the manual emergency release on the south gate. There was a pull-handle bypass in the gate frame that I'd located and tested during my original tour, but hadn't used since. The gate opened a person width. They came through. I shut it behind them. Her name was Beverly Callahan. The boy was her son Trevor, 16, quiet in the way that suggested he'd been quiet through things he shouldn't have had to be quiet through. She'd been a pharmacy tech before. That was the medicine. Not a stock of drugs, not a medical kit. Knowledge. She'd worked in pharmacies for 14 years, and she knew medication interactions, dosages, what was over the counter, and what wasn't. And she'd been collecting whatever she could find, as she and Trevor moved from place to place. She'd been with a larger group for about 3 weeks after the outbreak. The group had gone to pieces around day 17, not violently, just a gradual dissolution, different people leaving in different directions with different plans. She and Trevor had been on their own since then, sheltering in houses mostly, moving every few days. What she had in the bag she was carrying, 2 full bottles of amoxicillin from a prescription she'd found in an abandoned house, a bottle of codeine, various over-the-counter things, ibuprofen, acetaminophen, antihistamines, antacid, an EpiPen, blood pressure medication, a glucose monitor, a partial box of suture strips. Not everything, but the amoxicillin alone was worth a lot in a world without reliable wound care. I brought them to the management office. Walt looked at Bev and Trevor the way he looked at everything, assessing, saying nothing. Owen made them food and sat with Trevor while the teenager ate and slowly unclenched. That night, 5 people in the management suite, 4 sleeping bags and 2 thermal blankets on the floor. The building generator running on low, providing dim lighting and enough heat to keep the space at 60 degrees. Day 35 felt different. Not better necessarily, but less sparse. The group had weight, a shape. Days 36 through 50. Bev reorganized the medical supplies on day 36 and made a list that she kept on the wall beside my day counter sticky notes. A parallel record, what we had in terms of medical supplies, what we might need, what was critical to find if we ever had opportunity to forage. Watching her make that list, methodical and precise, and organized by category, I realized the group had just acquired something it didn't have before, actual medical competence. I asked her about the glucose monitor. None of us were diabetic, as far as I knew. She said, it tells you blood sugar, which tells you things about someone's overall health. It's also useful for checking if someone's in a stress response. She held it up, and it's a real medical instrument, which psychologically matters. People feel better when someone does something that looks like medicine. I thought about that. Day 38, Trevor surprised me. I came into the food court atrium late in the morning to find him sitting cross-legged on the floor in the middle of the space, completely still, with his eyes closed. I assumed he was sleeping and almost walked past. Then I noticed his posture, too upright for sleep, deliberate. I stopped, watched for a second. His eyes opened. He saw me. He said, "The floor vibrates differently when they come close to the south glass." I said, "What do you mean?" He put his palm flat on the tile floor. "Sit down. Feel." I sat down. It was subtle, barely there, but he was right. The building's structure transmitted vibration from the glass curtain wall on the south face, and when a significant weight pressed against the glass from outside, there was a faint resonance in the floor. The closer you got to the atrium space on the second floor, directly above the south entrance, the more pronounced it was. "How long have you been at this?" I asked. 3 days, Trevor said, "since you let us in." "You can tell it from people, or people are heavier," he said. "More of them, the more vibration. This morning, around 9, there were a lot against the south glass, more than usual." He wasn't looking at me when he said it, looking at the floor. They went away again. I sat with that for a moment. Trevor Callahan, 16 years old, had independently developed a passive monitoring system using the building's own structure and his sense of touch, without suggesting it to anyone, without making a project of it. Just quietly, over 3 days, had figured out something none of us older people had noticed. I told the group about it that night. Bev looked at her son with an expression that was only partly pride. The rest of it was something more complicated, something like recognition, like she was seeing a version of him that had been necessary, but that she'd hoped would never need to exist. Walt said, "We should map the other vibration points." He looked at Trevor. "You want to do that? Walk through the building with me?" Trevor said, "Yeah." They spent the next day doing exactly that, a building vibration survey, conducted by a 31-year maintenance veteran and a 16-year-old. By the end of it, they had a rough map of which points in the building gave the best physical sense of activity outside, and what the vibration patterns meant in terms of numbers and proximity. It wasn't a perfect early warning system. It was better than nothing. Day 41. I went foraging for the first time since day 0. The interior of the mall, within the building, not venturing outside, had stores that I'd inventoried in a basic way, but hadn't thoroughly searched. What I'd been saving for this was the sporting goods section. A mid-sized sporting goods kiosk on the east corridor ground floor, still locked with its gate down. The lock was a standard padlock on a hasp, and the key was in the management office key cabinet in the ring, labeled Ground Floor Retail Keys. Found it on the first try. Inside the kiosk, hiking gear, camping equipment, the sporting goods mid-market stuff you'd find anywhere. But among the camping section, 3 portable water filters, better than the straws we'd found in the storage room, 2 camp stoves, with 6 canisters of butane, camping cookware, pots, a pan, utensils, a waterproof bivouac sack, rope, about 60 feet of 6mm static cord, a folding handsaw, 4 headlamps with fresh batteries in the packages, a first aid kit that was actually comprehensive, better than anything we had, and in the back stockroom behind the kiosk, 12 energy bar cases, probably 1,000 bars total. The energy bars changed our nutritional situation dramatically. We'd been running on pasta, rice, canned goods, and cup noodles, which was sufficient but monotonous, and not particularly well balanced. Energy bars weren't perfect nutrition either, but they were dense calories with added vitamins, and having 1,000 of them in reserve meant our dry goods could last considerably longer. I also found something in the kiosk that I spent a lot of time looking at, a set of 2-way handheld radios, 5 of them packaged with charging cradles. The charging cradles ran on standard USB power, which we could provide through the generator circuit. Radios. We could talk to each other across the building. And, This was the thought that I turned over slowly and carefully. If we pointed one of the radios at a specific channel and just listened, we might hear something. I'd stopped trying to get internet signal. The cell towers in this area had gone down around day 20. Just stopped responding. No data, no calls, nothing. But radio, old analog radio, didn't need cell towers. AM radio could travel hundreds of miles in certain conditions. That night, I set up one of the 5 radios on channel 16, which is the maritime distress frequency that had been repurposed in some areas as a general survivor communication channel. Turned it to receive only. Left it running. For 4 days, mostly static. Day 45, a voice. Faint, intermittent, as if the signal was reaching us from a long distance, or through obstructions. A man's voice, repeating a message in a loop. I caught fragments. Shelter operational at the community center at Route 17, and then static, and operating every 3rd day, 7 a.m., come to the east parking area, and more static. A shelter. Someone was running a shelter and broadcasting its location. Route 17 was a highway about 30 miles northeast of us. 30 miles was a long way, but it was good information to have. I didn't tell the group right away. I wanted to have more information first. Clearer signal. More of the message. Something more concrete. What I had was fragments. And fragments of possibly wrong information were worse than no information because they created decisions based on false foundations. I told them on day 48, when I'd gotten 3 cleaner recordings of the message across different days. The discussion it generated was the first real disagreement we'd had. Owen wanted to go. He said it directly, on the first night of the discussion, without building to it. There's an organized shelter 30 miles away. That's better than this. We should go. Walt said, we don't know what organized means. Could be 10 people with a radio. Bev said, could be 1,000. Owen said, either way, it's people. People who are organized enough to maintain a radio broadcast. That's something. I said, we have supplies for potentially months here. Getting from here to there is 30 miles through open territory. Owen said, how many people? I paused. We don't know. The message said something about capacity. East parking area. That suggests they have space. Walt, who had said almost nothing to this point, spoke. We're not going anywhere until the snow comes and goes. Flat, complete. 30 miles on foot or in vehicles in November means cold, ice, and reduced visibility. We wait until spring. That's a better plan than radio voices. The room went quiet. He was right, and everyone knew it, and nobody felt entirely good about it. Owen didn't push after that, but he spent the next few evenings with the radio more than anyone else, listening for additional broadcasts. Day 50 arrived without ceremony. I marked it on the sticky note wall. Day 50. 50 days since day 0, since I sealed the fire doors from the BAS terminal and started eating the food court supplies and didn't leave. We were still here. We were arguably better positioned than we'd been on day 1. The group had skills distributed in a way that covered most of our vulnerabilities. The supplies were holding. The building was still secure. I should have been satisfied with that. Instead, I spent day 50's night hours thinking about who else might find us and what they might want when they did. The thing I hadn't accounted for. Day 52, Dale Oster arrived. He came from the east. I saw him from the management office window just after dawn. A single figure, crossing the east lot, walking steadily and without any of the evasive quality that Owen or Bev had shown. Walking the way you walk when you've run out of the energy to be afraid, or when you've made a calculation that stops the fear from mattering. He was carrying a bag over one shoulder, and in his other hand was a white pillowcase on a stick. A flag. He had a flag. I went down to the east corridor ground floor windows and watched him approach. 60s, lean, gray beard 3 weeks past a trim, moving with the efficiency of someone whose body has been performing hard labor and whose joints are starting to note their objections. He stopped about 20 feet from the east glass and held the pillowcase up and looked at the building. He said, not loudly but clearly, I'm a paramedic, 30 years. I know I look like trouble, I'm not. His name was Dale Oster, 61 years old, former emergency paramedic, had been sheltering in a house 6 blocks east for the past 5 weeks. The 2 people he'd been with in the house had died, one from a non-infected illness, a heart attack, and one from— He paused when he told me this, in the way that suggests the sentence doesn't have a finish that isn't awful. Complications from a situation that required medical intervention he wasn't equipped to provide. He said this to me through the glass before I let him in, not because I asked him to explain, because he'd decided that the way to be trusted was to say the hardest things first. I let him in. Bev's face when she saw Dale was interesting. She'd been our de facto medical resource since she arrived, and she'd been managing it well. But there's a ceiling to what a pharmacy tech knows without clinical experience. Dale was above that ceiling. They spent about 4 hours together that first evening, going through the medical supplies, going through the field surgery reference book Owen had found, comparing knowledge. I could hear them from the next room, their voices taking on that specific focused energy of 2 people who are both competent at something and discovering what the other one knows. Dale, we quickly learned, was also quietly very good at practical construction. He'd spent half his life restoring a farmhouse and had the accumulated skills of 20 years of weekend projects. Within 2 days of arriving, he'd reinforced 3 doors on the lower level that he'd assessed as weak without being asked, using lumber from a pallet of wood that had been left in the loading dock receiving area. The group was now 6. 6 people in a shopping mall that held enough food for— I did the math again with the higher consumption rate, perhaps 4 more weeks without any additional foraging. After that, we'd need to source food actively or start on the freeze-dried camp supplies, which were not going to feel like food in any satisfying way, but would keep us alive. There was also the question of the generator, which was now, at 6-person load, burning diesel at a slightly higher rate than before, because we'd added 1 more HVAC zone to the heating calculation. The main tank had about 730 gallons remaining, by my best estimate. Still good, but finite. Day 56. A minor incident on the 2nd floor that turned into a significant discovery. Walt had been doing a structural check of the 2nd floor exterior corridor on the north face. A regular maintenance tour he did once a week, looking for anything that had changed in the building's physical state. He came back with a piece of ceiling tile. Not damaged, not fallen, removed, recently removed by the look of the edges, and replaced, but not quite right. The reveal gaps were off. Someone had moved that ceiling tile and put it back. He showed me where it was, in the north face corridor near the maintenance access door for the building's main water supply riser. I went up with a step stool and pushed the tile aside and looked into the ceiling plenum space. A bag, a duffel bag, pushed up into the plenum space on top of the duct behind the riser pipe. I pulled it out, heavy, sat on the floor with it and unzipped it. Water, 6 liters of bottled water, a knife, not a kitchen knife, a serious fixed-blade knife with a Kydex sheath, canned food, 5 cans, a folded piece of paper with handwriting on it, a hand-drawn map of the building, floor by floor. Quite good, actually, better than the rough map I'd drawn on the marketing brochure on day 1, and a note, below the map, in neat printing. If you found this, you're probably good at finding things. The tunnel under the north lot connects to the storage building on County Road. I know where the key is. R. That was it. R, 1 letter, no other identification. The mystery of who had been living in this mall before me, which I'd thought was solved when Walt explained himself, turned out to have a 2nd chapter. Walt had been in the management suite. Someone else, someone who signed themselves R, had hidden a cache in a ceiling plenum on the 2nd floor and left a note about a tunnel. I brought the note to Walt. He read it twice. "The delivery tunnel," he said. "You know about it?" "I know it exists," he said slowly. "I've been in it once, maybe 8 years ago. There was a drainage issue." He paused. "It goes from the basement loading dock area, under the parking lot, out to a utility building by the road. I didn't know the far end had a key." "Who's R?" He shook his head. "I don't know everyone who's been in this building. We didn't know who R was. We didn't know if R was alive, or where R was. or whether R had intended for us to find this note or had left it for themselves and never come back to retrieve it. But the note told us two things. 1. There was someone who'd been in this building after the outbreak started who knew about the tunnel and had prepared for it. 2. The tunnel was real, traversable, and had a secondary access point we hadn't considered. I added it to the mental map I was carrying of our options. Not an immediate option, a last resort option. Exit Plan Z, for when plans A through Y had all failed. 2 days later, I went down to the basement and found the tunnel entrance. It was in the loading dock basement, behind the generator room actually, through a door I'd assumed was a utility room. Walt had the key. The door opened onto a concrete passage about 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, with a light fixture on the ceiling that ran on the emergency circuit, still powered, which meant we'd lit it the whole time without knowing it was there. The passage ran straight north for what felt like 40 yards, then curved slightly west, then ended at a steel door. The steel door had a drop bar lock on the inside and a cylinder lock on the outside. The drop bar I could lift from this side. The cylinder lock, I'd need a key for that if I was coming in from outside. I didn't go through the door. I lifted the drop bar, confirmed the door was otherwise solid, lowered the bar again, and went back to the building side. The county road utility building, whatever was on the other side, was our exit if we ever needed to exit. And whoever R was, they knew where the key was to get in from outside. Filed away, kept moving. Days 51 through 60. 8 people. That's what the group became on day 58, when Phil Warden's group came to the south entrance. I need to describe what happened carefully, and without getting ahead of myself, because I got things wrong at first, and then I got things right, and understanding how I got from wrong to right matters more than the outcome. Phil Warden was the first person we'd encountered who came to the south entrance in a coordinated way. By coordinated, I mean they'd clearly scoped the building before approaching. 2 people came forward to the glass while the others, I counted 6 behind the first 2, stayed back at the perimeter of the parking lot, spread out, watching the flanks. Someone had thought about approach. Phil came forward. He was maybe 45, fit in the lean way that comes from hardship rather than gym membership, and he had a face that was organized around being liked, good at eye contact, smiled in a way that I noticed before I noticed the smile's specific quality. He was accompanied by a woman, shorter, darker-haired, who stood slightly behind him and to his right, in the way that suggested she was used to being slightly behind him. He held up his hands when I appeared at the inner side of the gate, both hands, universal signal. "We've been watching this place for 2 days," he said through the glass. "We can see the lights at night. We know someone's in here." I said, "How many of you?" He said, 8, including me. I said, "What do you have?" He blinked, like he hadn't expected that question. "What do we have?" "Skills, resources, supplies." He turned slightly and looked at the woman behind him, turned back. "We've got a couple people with medical. We've got physical capacity, a lot of strong people. We've got fuel, 2 vehicles with full tanks." He paused. "We've got a solar charging setup." The solar charging setup was what made me pay attention. A working solar setup meant electronics, which meant potentially radio communications, which we were limited on. It was a practical resource. I said, "I need to talk to my group." "Wait here," he said. "Sure," like we were discussing something casual. I went back upstairs. The group was in the management office. I laid it out exactly as it had happened. 8 people at the south entrance, claiming medical capacity and solar equipment, scouting approach. "I don't like the scouting," Dale said immediately. I said, "Tell me why." 2 days watching and then a coordinated approach, Dale said. "That's not desperation, that's planning. People who are desperate come up straight to the door and knock. People who plan first are planning for something specific." "Could be just careful," Owen said. "Could be," Dale said. "I'm saying it's worth noting." Bev said, 8 more people is a lot of mouths. It's also a lot of hands," I said. Walt said nothing, watching the window. I said, "I'm inclined to try them provisionally. 1 person at a time for the first night. We assess, we decide, but we do it carefully." Dale said, "Who comes in first?" Good question. I hadn't thought about that. Then I thought about it. Not Phil, I said. Whoever he's keeping in the background. I went back to the south entrance. Here's what we're offering, I told Phil through the glass. One person comes in tonight. Not you. Someone else from your group. One person. Overnight. We assess in the morning. If that works, we discuss the rest. Phil's face did something that was very brief and very controlled. Not anger. More like recalculation. He said, "That's unusual." "Yes," I said. He turned and spoke to the woman beside him, quietly, then looked back. "Angie," he said, she'll come in. She's a nurse." Angie Prescott came through the south entrance that evening at dusk, after the 6 in the background had retreated from visible range, and Phil had stepped back from the glass. She had a backpack. She was 30-something, tired in a specific way that meant she'd been managing other people's needs for a long time. She shook my hand and looked me directly in the eye and said, "I'm assuming you want to know if I'm reliable." I said, "I want to know if Phil's reliable." She looked at me for a moment. "He's organized," she said. "He keeps people alive. That's what I know." She paused. "He's also particular about how things go." I thought about the word particular. "Particular how?" I said. "He has a clear idea of how situations should be arranged," she said. "He doesn't usually argue about it. He just arranges them." I said, "Thank you." She said, "I'm not trying to warn you. I'm trying to be accurate." I thought about the difference between those two things for the rest of that night. In the morning, after Angie had been integrated for a full day without incident, she and Bev had spent most of the evening in what amounted to a medical consultation, and Dale had been drawn in, and the 3 of them had apparently covered a significant amount of clinical territory. I let Phil's group in. 7 more people, bringing us to 15 total. The management suite was no longer large enough to serve as a single living space. We expanded to the conference room and the storage room, cleared of Christmas decorations, set up sleeping areas, established a kitchen rota using the food court vendors' facilities on the 2nd floor. And now is when things got complicated. The complications. Phil Warden was very good at being in a room. I noticed this about him the way you notice a structural feature in a building. Not immediately, not all at once, but accumulating observation until the thing becomes undeniable. He was good at being in a room in the specific way that means when he spoke, people oriented toward him. Not because he said smart things, necessarily. Sometimes he said things that were slightly off, slightly too confident, but because he said them with a particular weight that made them feel decided, like the sentence structure itself was already a conclusion. He came to me on day 60 and proposed that we reorganize the resource management. "The food distribution isn't efficient," he said. We were in the break room, which had become the default meeting space. He said it the way you state a known fact. People are taking more than they need, and we're not tracking it. I said, "Owen tracks it. He's been doing it since day 14. Phil said, "Owen's tracking it in a notebook that nobody else can check. It needs to be visible. A posted schedule, quantities per person, daily checkoff." I said, "That's a reasonable idea. Let's talk to Owen about it." Phil said, "I can set it up if you're busy." I said, "Let's talk to Owen about it." A small beat. Then, "Sure," and he smiled. That was the pattern, a suggestion that made sense on its surface, positioned as efficiency, with a move toward implementation that bypassed the people who were already doing the thing. When I caught it, which took me a few days too long, it was always like that. The suggestion itself was never wrong. The pathway around the established person was always there. On day 62, Phil had a one-on-one conversation with Trevor that Bev mentioned to me in passing because Trevor had seemed subdued afterward. She didn't know what was said. I didn't ask Trevor directly because he was 16 and I didn't want to make him feel surveilled. But I noted it. On day 63, one of Phil's group, a man named Roger, large, uncommunicative, spent several hours on the roof without telling anyone where he was going. When I asked him about it later, he said he'd been checking the generator ventilation. The generator was in the basement. The ventilation check he described couldn't have been done from the roof. On day 64, Phil suggested we do a sortie outside to retrieve the solar equipment from his group's vehicles, which were apparently parked 4 blocks away. "It's a good opportunity," he said. "The infected density on the East Road has been low this week. We could run out, get the panels and the battery, be back in an hour." Dale said, "How do you know the infected density on the East Road?" Phil said, "We've been observing." "From where?" "The roof." "What were you observing from the roof?" Dale asked. His voice was the same as always, but there was something underneath it. Phil said, "The surroundings. What else would we be observing?" I said, "I'll take the sortie plan under consideration," meaning I'd think about it and talk to Walt first. After the meeting, I found Walt alone in the mechanical room. I told him what Phil had said. Walt said, "He wants outside." "Why would he want outside if he's already outside getting to us?" "He wants inside control. Outside observation is his baseline. He's comfortable with it." Walt turned back to the panel he'd been examining. "You know, that tunnel you found. If I were him, and I'd found this building first." He stopped. "He didn't find it first," I said. "No," Walt said. "He didn't. The tunnel. The note from R. I hadn't told Phil's group about the tunnel. I hadn't told any of the newcomers about it, actually. Not Bev and Trevor. Not Dale. Not Angie. It was on the mental list of things that were mine to manage. The things that mattered too much to be general knowledge. Now I was thinking about whether that was the right call. Day 65. Something happened that knocked all of this into a different frame entirely. The thing with Kyle. One of Phil's people was a man in his mid-40s named Kyle. He'd said almost nothing since he arrived. Not quiet in the Walt way. Quiet in a different way. A slightly unhinged quietness that had its own texture. He ate alone most of the time. He slept in the conference room corner with his back to the wall. He didn't do any of the assigned tasks, but when an unassigned task appeared in front of him, something physical, moving something heavy, a janitorial thing nobody wanted, he'd do it without being asked. On day 65, Bev came to me and said she was worried about Kyle. I said, "Why?" She said, "He keeps his left arm covered, even inside, even when it's warm enough not to." I said, "Let's not jump to anything." She said, "I'm not jumping. I'm telling you what I see." That evening, I asked Angie about it, obliquely. Not, "Is Kyle bitten?" Something more like, "What's Kyle's situation? What do you know about him?" Angie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He joined us late, about 2 weeks before we found you. He'd been alone for a while." I said, "Does he have an injury?" She met my eyes. "He said he burned his arm, from a fire." I said, "Did you see the burn?" She said, "No." We both sat with that. I went to Kyle that night. Directly, not sideways. I sat down across from him in the conference room and said, "I need to see your arm." He looked at me for a long time. His face went through something that wasn't what I expected. Not guilt or fear. Something more tired, more resigned. He said, "It's not what you think." I said, "Show me." He pulled up his left sleeve. It was a bite. Old, healing. Probably 2 to 3 weeks old by the appearance. Closed over. The surrounding tissue was the darkened, slightly swollen look of a healed wound, rather than an infected one. He was alive, bitten 2 to 3 weeks ago, and alive and lucid and not presenting any of the signs I'd observed in the infected. I stared at the wound for a moment. Then I sat back. He said, "I know what you're thinking. I thought it too. I waited for it. Every morning I woke up and I thought, today's the day. It didn't come." I said, "You're different. Some people are different." He said, "I don't know why." I sat there for a while longer. In another version of this, I'd have made a different decision. A harder one. In this version, I looked at a man who'd been carrying this for 3 weeks, waiting to die from it every morning, and not dying. And I said, "Does Phil know?" "No," he said. "Why not?" He said, "Because Phil doesn't." He stopped. Phil would have made a decision. I thought about that sentence for a long time, the specific way he'd said it. Not, Phil would have been scared, or Phil would have thrown me out. Phil would have made a decision, like the decision was always already made, just waiting for information to apply it to. I said, "Nobody else knows?" "Angie knows I have a wound," he said. "She doesn't know what kind." I said, "Keep covering it, for now. And then, because that wasn't enough, I'm not going to tell Phil. But if your condition changes, if anything changes, you tell me first, immediately." He nodded. I went back to the management office and sat for an hour in the dark, thinking about what Kyle's survival of a bite meant for our understanding of the infection. It had to mean something about individual biology, immune response, something genetic, something we couldn't identify or reproduce without laboratory access we didn't have. He wasn't a cure. He wasn't proof of anything generalizable. He was just a person who'd been bitten and hadn't turned. But he was alive, and he was evidence that the world was more complicated than our working rules suggested. I held on to that. Day 68 through 75. Phil's push for the sortie resurfaced on day 68, with more structure than before. He'd prepared something that looked like a proposal, handwritten on several sheets of paper, a route map, a time plan, a list of what his vehicles presumably held, and why it was worth retrieving. He presented it in the break room with everyone present. "The solar panels and battery bank are in the truck," he said. "If we retrieve them, we can reduce generator consumption significantly. Cut our diesel use in half for anything we can run on the solar circuit during daytime." It was a compelling case. The solar would genuinely extend our generator life. Dale said, "How do we know the vehicles are still where you left them?" Phil said, "We've been observing the area from the roof. They're still there." Owen said, "The route you're showing goes through 2 intersections that we haven't cleared. We don't know what's in those intersections." Phil said, "That's why we observe first and move fast, in and out." I said, "Who do you propose goes?" He said, 3 of mine and 1 of yours, for building re-entry, meaning a member of our group who knew the re-entry protocol. 2 of ours, I said, immediately, without thinking. Just knew that was the number. A small shift in his expression. 2 from your side, 3 from mine. 5 total. I said, "Let me think about it." That evening, I had a conversation with Walt and Dale together. Outside the management suite, in the corridor, the hand crank radio between us turned off. Dale said it directly. He wants those vehicles inside our operational perimeter. I said maybe he just wants the solar. Maybe both, Dale said. But if those vehicles get inside or adjacent, he has a mobility resource nobody else has. Walt said, "The solar is worth having." I said, "I know." "But not if the vehicles come with conditions attached," Dale said. I thought about it. What if we go to the vehicles and retrieve the solar equipment without bringing the vehicles themselves in? Walt said, "Worth doing." That's what I proposed to Phil the next morning. A sortie, to retrieve the solar panels and battery only, leaving the vehicles where they were. I'd go personally, with Dale, and 2 of Phil's people. His choice. Phil's face did the recalculation thing again, faster this time. Then, fine. That works. We did the sortie on day 70. Dale and I plus a woman from Phil's group named Carla, quiet, competent, clearly the one Phil actually trusted to get things done, and a younger man named Aaron. 4 a.m. start, first light. The infected density on the east approach was low, as Phil had said. We moved fast, minimizing sound. Reached the vehicles, 2 of them, parked in a church parking lot 4 blocks east, in under 20 minutes. The solar setup was real, and it was good. 4 200-watt panels, a 2,000 watt-hour lithium battery bank, an inverter. We loaded it onto a flatbed dolly we'd brought from the loading dock, covered it with a moving blanket to reduce profile, and moved back toward the mall. On the way back, we passed a house that I'd noticed on the way out. A 2-story, set back from the road. On the way out, I'd noticed it because the front door was open, and the porch had several items on it that looked deliberate. Not abandoned scatter, but arranged. A bucket, some kind of container, a piece of fabric tied to the porch rail. On the way back, I noticed there was someone in the upstairs window. Not infected, a person, standing back from the glass, watching us pass. I slowed down. The others didn't notice. They were focused forward. I looked at the upstairs window. The person raised a hand, not a wave, just a raising. Identification. I see you. You see me. I looked for a moment, then kept moving. I didn't tell the others, not yet. Back at the mall, we got the solar equipment in through the loading dock personnel door before noon. It was a good day, practically speaking. The solar would add meaningful power. Phil seemed satisfied. I couldn't stop thinking about the person in the upstairs window. Day 72. I went back to that house. Alone. Without telling anyone where I was going, which I later acknowledged to Dale was a mistake, and I accepted the lecture. The house's front door was still open. The bucket on the porch had water in it. Fresh, not stagnant. The fabric on the rail was a bandana, red, signal color. I called from the porch, not loudly. "Hello." A long pause. Then from inside. "Come in." Back of the house. I went in. In the kitchen. At the back of the house. A teenager, maybe 15 or 16. Sitting at the kitchen table with a backpack in front of him, open, showing me its contents. Food, water, a first aid kit. A kid who'd learned to show his hands early. His name was Robbie. He said it and nothing else for a while, just Robbie. He'd been alone since day 20. His parents had been at work when everything went down, and he'd been home, and they hadn't come back, and after several days of waiting, he'd concluded they weren't going to. He'd been surviving in this house, and the adjacent ones, moving carefully, staying quiet. He'd seen us on the first sortie, and then waited. He said, "I didn't want to come to the mall. Too many people. Someone might." He stopped. I saw the other group. The one with the tall man. Phil's group. "When?" I asked. "Before they went to your mall," he said. 3 days before. They were here on this road. Looking at houses. They took stuff from 2 of them. He described what they took. A gas generator from a garage. Canned goods from a kitchen. And, he said this carefully, they'd found a woman in one of the houses. Alone. And she'd left with them. Not under force. He was clear about that. But he described the conversation as happening in a way that left the impression that leaving was the cleaner option of those available. I sat with that for a while. "Would you come to the mall?" I asked. He thought about it for a long time. "Is the tall man in charge there?" "No," I said. "Nobody's in charge there." And then, because that wasn't quite right, "I'm in charge, in the sense that I run the building. The building is what keeps us alive. Nobody runs the people." Robbie looked at me. Assessing. He had the eyes of someone who'd been assessing situations for survival purposes for a while and had gotten reasonably good at it. "Okay," he said. "Yes." I brought Robbie back through the loading dock that evening. 16 people total, a number that had its own weight. I told Dale what Robbie had said about Phil's group and the woman in the house. Dale listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to wait. Watch. Keep things stable." He said, "For how long?" I said, "Until I know what Phil actually wants." What Phil actually wanted became clearer on day 75. And it wasn't what I'd been thinking. It was both simpler and worse. Day 75. Phil came to me directly. No intermediary, no building to it. He walked into the break room where I was eating breakfast. Oatmeal, made with stored water and sugar from the food court supplies, which had become my standard morning, and sat down across from me. He said, "I want to talk about how this is organized." I said, "Okay." He said, 15 people is a lot to coordinate informally. Things are going to slip. We're going to have conflicts, miscommunication, decisions that don't get made, because nobody has clear authority to make them." "All true," I said. "What are you proposing?" He said, "A formal structure, defined roles, clear lines." I said, "With you at the top." He paused. "Someone has to be." I said, "What about me?" He said, "You'd keep running the building systems. That's what you're good at. The building side." The building side. Like the building was a department. like the thing that kept all 16 of us alive, was a middle management function. I looked at him for a moment. I said, "Phil, I've been in this building for 75 days. I sealed it. I maintained it. I've got the generator, the water system, the security control, the supply inventory, all of it." I paused. If I chose to stop running the building side, this entire place stops in about 3 days. He said, "Nobody's suggesting you stop. What you're suggesting," I said, "is that I run the technical operations under someone else's decision authority, which means someone who doesn't understand those systems making calls about them." He said, "That's how organizations work." I said, "This isn't an organization, it's a building." He looked at me steadily. "It's going to be one or the other," he said, "sooner or later." He left. I went to find Walt. The shift. Something changed after day 75 that I'm trying to describe accurately, because getting it wrong, making it more dramatic than it was, or less, matters. What changed? The temperature of the group shifted, not obviously, not confrontationally. Things that had been cooperative acquired a slight undertone of transactional exchange. Phil's people started clustering differently during meals, during the evening radio sessions, during the morning walkthroughs I did with Walt. They were still functional, still participating, but there was an invisible line that had been drawn, and the positioning on either side of it was becoming clearer. Angie stayed close to our original group. She didn't announce this. She just, by the physics of her movements over several days, ended up spending more time with Bev and Dale than with Phil's people. Kyle stayed near nobody in particular. Roger, the large, uncommunicative one who'd been on the roof during the lie-about checking ventilation incident, started spending time in the basement. Not the generator room, not the loading dock, the intermediate corridor, near the storage room where our main food supply was. I noted this. I moved 2 of the most critical food stocks from the storage room to the management office's locked storage, which had a key I controlled. I did it over 2 nights, without making it obvious. A third of the pasta and rice, the cooking oil, the freeze-dried camp food. Hidden in the office behind the Christmas decoration boxes, Walt noticed what I was doing and helped without asking why. On day 79, I told the full original group, Owen, Bev, Trevor, Dale, Walt, about the delivery tunnel. All of it. The note from R, the location, the drop bar mechanism, the county road exit. Dale listened with the expression of someone doing math. Owen wrote it down in his notebook. I also told Angie, not because I fully trusted her, I didn't, yet, but because she had proved to be the most honest member of Phil's group, and honest people tend to act in ways you can predict. I didn't tell Kyle, not because I didn't trust him, but because information has weight, and he was already carrying enough. Day 80, Phil made his actual move. He asked the full group to gather in the food court for what he called a community meeting. It wasn't a suggestion. He'd already spoken individually to most people, and it had the quality of an announced event by the time it reached me through Trevor, who'd heard it from one of Phil's group that morning. I went. Everyone went. Phil had set up in the food court in a way that gave him a natural speaking position. Standing near the center of the atrium with the skylight above him, everyone else seated on the food court chairs he'd arranged in a rough semicircle. Good staging. I noticed the staging. He spoke for maybe 10 minutes. It was reasonable, mostly. He talked about the challenges of maintaining a large group with limited resources and no defined decision structure. He talked about efficiency and coordination. He said several things about making this sustainable that were unarguably correct. Then he said, "I'm proposing that we formalize a council structure with defined roles. Garrett manages the building systems. I'd propose to take on logistics and security coordination. We'd operate jointly, with major decisions going to a group vote." It was, on the surface, a reasonable proposal. Sharing authority, group vote on major decisions, formal roles. What it was structurally, Phil in charge of physical security and resource logistics, the 2 most powerful positions, with group vote as cover, that would, in practice, be directed by Phil's 7 votes against our smaller group's 8, with the real dynamic dependent on who could be moved. I said, I'd like a day to think about this. Phil said, of course. That evening, I sat with Dale and Owen and Walt in the management office. Bev had Trevor in the next room. The solar charging system was running on the battery bank, giving us a low amber glow from a small LED lamp. Dale said, he's got Carla, Aaron, the two quiet ones, and Roger. That's 5 who'll vote with him regardless, plus anyone he can move. I said, he won't get Angie. Owen said, he might get Kyle. I said, he won't. I was certain of this, and I couldn't say why in terms Dale would accept, so I just said it and hoped they took it on trust. Walt said, what are we actually deciding? I said, whether to accept the structure or reject it. And if we reject it? I said, then we have a real problem. Walt said, or we use the tunnel. That was the first time anyone had said it directly. Use the tunnel. We all sat with that for a moment. The tunnel led to the county road utility building. It was winter now, early December. Cold but not brutal. County road was northeast of us, probably a mile from the highway we'd want to be on. 30 miles to the shelter broadcasting on the radio. In vehicles, if there were usable vehicles on that road, or in the utility building, or if we could get to Phil's trucks. It was a day's drive at most. Not yet, I said. The situation isn't at that point. Owen said, when is that point? I said, when it's not safe here anymore. When the building can't protect us from what's inside it, as well as outside it. I looked at the faces in the low amber light. We're not there. I want to find a way that doesn't require blowing up what we've built. What I proposed the next morning, day 81, was not what Phil had proposed, and not a rejection of it, a modification. I said yes to the council structure. I said yes to formal roles. Then I specified the roles differently. Building operations, me. Food management and inventory, Owen, as it had been. Medical, Bev and Dale jointly. Security monitoring, Trevor, whose building vibration monitoring system had been running quietly and reliably for weeks, and who knew the building's behavioral patterns better than anyone, except maybe Walt. Physical maintenance, Walt. External coordination and resource acquisition, Phil, which was genuinely his strength. The sortie, the vehicle management, the outside world navigation. I gave him the thing he was actually good at, in the genuine domain where he'd added value. The votes on major decisions, I said, go to the council, 2 from each functional area. That's 10 votes. Majority carries. Phil's head was working through the math. His functional area, external coordination, was him and 1 designee. 2 votes. The rest of the functional areas were distributed among people who, by now, were mostly oriented toward our original group. He said, that seems like it limits my area's influence. I said, every area has 2 votes. Yours is the same as mine. He said, but my area is arguably the highest risk and the most important for our future options. I said, our future options depend on this building staying functional and this group staying fed and healthy. Every area is important. A long moment. He said, I'd want to revisit the area definitions in 2 weeks. I said, sure. He accepted. It wasn't a win. It was a draw, and a temporary one. But temporary was what I needed right then, because something was coming that none of us were ready for. Days 86 through 88. On day 86, the explosion happened. We all heard it. An enormous sound from somewhere to the south. Not a crack, not a bang, but a sustained roar that took several seconds to arrive at us across the distance, and then another few seconds to fade. The windows on the south face rattled in their frames. Trevor came to find me almost immediately, face tighter than usual. The floor is going crazy. I went to the second floor atrium and stood on the tile and felt it. The vibration was unlike anything Trevor's monitoring system had ever registered. It wasn't a crowd at the glass. It wasn't a cluster of infected against the south wall. It was distributed, all around, like the building was sitting in a field of something that was moving. I went to the management office window. The south parking lot, which had never been empty since day 8 or so, which had accumulated a background population of 40 to 60 infected throughout our time here, was different. The difference was in direction. They were moving, not in their usual slow, aimless pattern, moving with the specific directional quality I'd only seen once before, the day the car alarm had drawn 8 of them off the east lot all at once, but scaled up by a factor I couldn't easily calculate. They were moving north, through the south lot, from the south, coming north. Not from our building, coming toward it. I said to Walt, who'd appeared beside me. How many? He counted for 30 seconds. I can't count them. Which told me a number that the human brain doesn't easily quantify, more than could be individually tracked. We found out later, from Owen's radio monitoring over the subsequent days, from fragments of message he pieced together, that a fuel storage facility about 4 miles south had detonated. Massive explosion, the kind that sends a shockwave that can be felt 20 miles away. And the sound, the sustained roar of a fuel fire, had drawn every infected in the surrounding area like a compass needle toward magnetic north, except north in this case was the direction of the explosion. And then from the explosion, they'd expanded outward, and the expansion had a northern vector that aimed directly at us. By day 86 evening, the south lot was full in a way that I could not have imagined on day 0. The south glass, the glass and aluminum storefront that we'd reinforced as best we could, that the welded scissor gate was protecting, was under a pressure it had not been designed for. The gate held, but I could hear it from 3 floors up, a low, continuous groan, and the floor vibration Trevor monitored was a constant now, rather than an intermittent read. The north lot, previously our safer perimeter, was thickening. They were coming around the building, flowing around it the way water flows around a rock. The loading dock side, which had been manageable, was becoming a different situation. I called a full group meeting that evening. Phil didn't stage it. I did. I told everyone exactly what I could observe and calculate. South entrance, under sustained pressure from a large number. North side, increasing. East and west faces, building crowd. Generator status, approximately 100 hours of diesel remaining at current consumption, reduced to 60 if we needed to run all 4 HVAC units for full building heating. Water, sufficient. Food, sufficient for approximately 3 weeks. Building structural status, the south glass was the weak point. If the gate failed, Phil interrupted. The gate is welded. It's welded to a glass and aluminum frame, I said. If the weight against it exceeds the frame's structural rating, which was never designed for this, the frame fails, not the gate. But silence. I said, we need to leave. Phil said, where? Northeast. I said, there's a shelter at Route 17 and County Road. We've had their signal for over a month. They're operating. Phil said, how do we get there? I said, through the tunnel under the north lot. Phil's expression shifted. Something worked through his face that I couldn't read completely. He knew about the tunnel now. I'd disclosed it in the council structure discussion, but he'd been processing it as a theoretical option, not an immediate reality. He said, the vehicles are parked 4 blocks east. I said, we can't reach them now. The east lot is thickening. He said, my group has resources in those vehicles. I said, we'll have to leave without them. Something passed through him. Not anger, something colder. He said, I want to think about this. I said, there's time, not a lot, but some. Day 87 was the day the south glass cracked. Not catastrophically. A crack, starting at the lower right corner of one panel, running diagonally toward center. The frame was flexing under the weight. Trevor felt it through the floor before any of us saw it, woke me up at 5 a.m. to say something changed. I went to look at the crack and came back and found Phil already awake, already in the break room with Roger and Aaron and Carla. A quiet conversation that stopped when I walked in. He said, we're going tonight. I said, good. He said, my people are going first, through the tunnel. I looked at him steadily. No. He said, there are 8 of us. We move faster without. No, I said again, more quiet than the first time. This isn't a negotiation, Phil. You don't know where the tunnel goes or what's on the other side. And neither do I. except that there's a key at the far end that I don't have. The group goes together, or there's no tunnel access. A long look. Roger was a large presence on my peripheral vision. I noticed this and didn't react to it. Phil said, "And if we disagree?" I said, "Then you try the south entrance." I paused, "But I don't think you want that." The thing about Phil Warden, and I want to say this accurately, because writing him as a monster is wrong, was that he was not irrational. He was self-interested in a focused way, he was manipulative in a structural way, and he would run a calculation that always included himself at the top. But he wasn't stupid, and he could recognize when a calculation came out against his position. The calculation here was 8 of his people, plus the tunnel, versus my 4, and the building know-how. The tunnel was in my basement. The key to the far end was a problem he hadn't solved. Without my cooperation, the tunnel was a concrete passage that might or might not lead somewhere useful. He said, "Together." I said, "Good." I spent day 87 preparing, not packing. There wasn't much to pack. Useful supplies that could be carried, food for 4 days, water, the medical kit, the radio, the radios, all 5, the water filter, the maps, tools I couldn't replace elsewhere, my laptop, useless without power, but had building system documentation on it that might matter someday, the multimeter, a full set of hand tools, Dale's medical bag, Bev's medication collection. Walt, meanwhile, went to the basement and did something he hadn't told me he was going to do. He came back up mid-afternoon with a slight, specific look on his face. "There's something in the tunnel," he said. Came to the door and looked, then went back. One, moving away when I last saw it, toward the far end. "The far end is locked." "Yes," he said. "Something in the tunnel, heading away from us, toward the locked exit." Something that didn't, in Walt's assessment, which I trusted completely, present immediately. But something. We'd seen this before. An infected in an enclosed space, contained, not able to exit, bouncing against a dead end. A problem, but a manageable one. "We deal with it on the way through," I said. Yes. That evening I found Robbie in the corridor outside the management suite, sitting on the floor with his backpack between his knees. He'd been packed since day 86. I sat down beside him on the floor. He said, "Is the tunnel long?" I said, "Maybe 50 yards. He said, "What's at the end?" I said, "A utility building, and from there, a road, and from there, a 30-mile drive or walk to a place where people are organizing." He said, "And the thing in the tunnel?" I looked at him. He'd heard Walt and me talking. I said, "We'll deal with it." He nodded, said nothing else, just sat there in the corridor, with his backpack between his knees. Day 88 night. The crack in the south glass extended to 3 cracks by 9 p.m. Trevor called it from the floor vibration without going to look. He'd gotten accurate enough that he could read pressure changes in real time. The frame was deforming, not failing yet. Soon. I convened the group at 10 p.m. 16 people in the food court atrium, in the dark. We'd been running the generator on reduced load all day to save diesel for whatever might happen after. And the atrium ran on no electrical lighting anyway, in the gray ambient light that came down from the skylight. I said we leave at 4 a.m., first light before dawn, move through the tunnel together. One group, one line, 15 feet between each person and the one ahead, slow and controlled. No running, no flashlights except one at the front and one at the back. No speaking above a whisper. Phil's people and ours, mixed in the line. I'd thought about this carefully. Intermixing meant nobody had a de facto block at any point. Angie and Kyle behind me at the front. Dale and Bev and Trevor in the middle. Owen and Walt at the back. Robbie between Walt and Dale. I wanted Robbie near adults he trusted. Phil in the line like everyone else. Not at the front, not at the back. The middle, where he couldn't run ahead and couldn't linger. I asked if anyone had questions. Trevor said, "What about the thing in the tunnel?" I said, "I'll handle it." Bev said, "Handle it how?" Walt, who was standing near the back of the group, said, without any particular emphasis, "The same way you handle anything in a corridor. You get in front of it and you close it out. He was holding the mop handle. He'd been carrying it for 88 days. I don't know if he'd washed it since day 0. I didn't ask. Phil said, "If the far door is locked, what's the plan?" I said, "The note said the key was at the far end. I'm going to look for it." He said, "That's not a plan." I said, "It's what we have." Silence. Angie raised her hand slightly, the way someone does who's used to classroom protocols. She said, "I want to say something." She looked around the group. "Whatever happens after we get out, the people in this room we all did what was necessary in here. I don't think we should lose that when we're outside." Nobody said anything in response, but I noticed Kyle, in the back corner, nod once. Barely. I went to the management office for the last time at 11 p.m. Stood in it for a few minutes. The sticky note calendar on the wall. 88 days of marks in a grid, starting from the first Monday in October, when I drove to this building for what was supposed to be a 3-day documentation job. The notes got sparser and sparser toward the end. Later days had only 1 or 2 words, sometimes just an X, because later days were harder to summarize. The window faced the parking lot. I looked out for a while. The south lot was a mass of presence in the dark. I couldn't see individuals anymore. It was a dark field, shifting, the way a field of grain shifts in wind. Except it was shifting because everything in it was moving, all at once, in small motions that added up to a continuous slow heave. The south glass cracked again, while I was standing there. I heard it from above. A small, sharp report, like a rifle shot at distance. Not the main frame giving way. A panel edge. Getting close. I left the window, collected the go bag I'd assembled, and went to wait for 4 a.m. Day 89. The tunnel. I want to describe this part slowly because I was not slow when it happened, and going through it quickly at the time means I lost some of it. Writing it slowly now is how I recover what got compressed in the doing. 4 a.m. The south glass went fully the same hour, not the frame exactly. One of the main panels gave way under the pressure. A sound that we all heard from the basement level where we'd assembled. A prolonged crack, and then a lower sound, heavier. That was the weight above the glass redistributing into a new configuration. The welded gate held, for now. But the sound was different. No longer the groan of something resisting, more the groan of something that has moved and hasn't found its new equilibrium. We didn't wait to see what happened next. I went first, through the personnel door beside the roll-up dock door, into the passage. Concrete walls, the emergency light still burning on its circuit, casting a flat white light that reached about 30 feet ahead before it grayed out. The tunnel was narrower than I'd remembered from my one previous visit. Not claustrophobically narrow. You could walk upright, arms not quite touching the walls. But the 16 of us in a line filled it in a way that gave the space a different quality than it had when I was alone in it. I could smell something ahead. Not rot. Something else. Damp concrete and something that had been living in here. A specific animal quality that I won't compare to anything, because nothing in my previous experience matched it exactly. Angie, behind me, whispered, "I can smell it." I whispered, "Stay close." 20 feet in, my headlamp picked up the shape of it. Against the east wall of the tunnel, at about 40 feet from where we'd entered, standing, facing us, not moving. I stopped. The line behind me compressed slightly as people closed the gap, then steadied. The thing in the tunnel was looking at us. I say that knowing it's not accurate. They don't look in the way that implies the visual signal goes anywhere useful, but the face was oriented toward us, and toward my headlamp, and the light seemed to reach whatever sensory response it had, because it started to move. Not toward us, away, backing into the dark ahead. Toward the locked far door. I went after it. This sounds like the wrong decision, and maybe it was. The alternative was standing still and letting it find its equilibrium in the darkness ahead, which meant we'd be moving through the tunnel toward something that had stopped and reoriented. Moving was better. It didn't run. They don't run. But it moved with a speed that surprised me. A jerky, uneven acceleration down the tunnel, and I matched it, my headlamp bouncing on the walls. It hit the far door before I reached it. The door was steel, as I'd described, with the drop bar on the inside and the cylinder lock outside. The drop bar. I'd left it engaged on my last visit. The thing hit the door with the full weight of its body, the same persistent pressure I'd observed against glass and brick for 88 days, and the drop bar held the door shut against the impact. I closed the distance. I had a length of steel pipe from the maintenance room in my right hand. Not Walt's mop handle, that was Walt's. And I used it the way you use a tool when the tool is what you have. Once, cleanly, from close range. It took two to be sure. I stood in the dark tunnel for a moment after, breathing, the headlamp casting its flat circle on the concrete wall ahead. Then I started looking for the key. The note from R had said, "I know where the key is," which was not, technically, information about where the key was. But whoever R was, they'd prepared this location specifically. They'd cached supplies. They'd known the tunnel. They'd left a note. People who do that kind of thing think in patterns. If they know where something is, they leave the knowing findable. I ran the headlamp over the doorframe. Concrete surround, painted over multiple times. The light fitting above the door. Same style as the others in the tunnel, but slightly older, mounted slightly differently. I looked at the mounting. A cover plate, 2 screws. I used the flat of my multimeter as a screwdriver tip, a trick I'd done once before on a tight access panel. The cover plate came off. Behind it, mounted to the wall on a small hook, a single key on a ring. I've had feelings of relief in my life that were more dramatic than what I felt when my headlamp hit that key on its hook, but none that mattered more. The key worked. I turned it, heard the cylinder release, pushed the bar, opened the door. Cold air, darkness beyond, and the smell of outside, which still smelled different from how outside used to smell, but it smelled like winter and distance and space. And after 88 days inside 4 walls, it was the most substantial air I'd breathed. I looked back down the tunnel. The headlamp at the back, Dale's, was a small light a long way behind me. I called back, quietly, but enough for the acoustics to carry. "Doors open. Move." They came through in the dark, the whole line of them, one after another, emerging into the utility building on the county roadside. The utility building was a concrete block structure, maybe 20 by 30 feet, with a sliding metal door on the road face that was secured with a padlock on the outside. I waited for everyone to come through before I addressed the padlock. Walt came through last, pulling the tunnel door closed behind him. 16 people in a concrete room, 20 by 30 feet, in the dark, breathing the same cold air, not speaking. I checked the sliding door. The padlock was on the outside, no release from inside. I looked at the door frame, then I looked at the hinges, heavy, strap hinges, surface mounted to the concrete block with expansion anchors. Old. I said to Walt, very quietly, "Can you get a hinge?" He looked at it for maybe 4 seconds. Then he held out his hand, and I gave him the crowbar from my bag, and he worked the crowbar behind the upper hinge strap and leaned into it. It took 3 minutes. The anchor pulled out of the concrete with a scraping sound that I felt in my chest, and then the door moved enough on the remaining lower hinge that we could push through the gap. County Road. Pre-dawn gray. Cold. Clear. The stars still visible in the western sky. The road was empty, no infected visible in either direction. The north side was a field, dead grass, a tree line a quarter-mile back. The south side was the back of the mall parking lot, visible over the landscaped berm. I looked at the mall. From out here, from the back, it looked just like a building, a large commercial structure behind a landscaped berm. Nothing wrong from this angle, nothing to see. Then from somewhere inside the building, transmitted through all that concrete and steel, I heard the south frame finally give way. Not an explosion, more of a sustained structural creak, a deep settling sound, something moving into a new position it would hold forever. We were out. Owen, standing beside me, said nothing. He was holding his notebook. Bev had her arm around Trevor's shoulders. Trevor was looking at the sky. Dale was already scanning the road in both directions, paramedic's head, assessing. Phil stood slightly apart from the group, looking north up the county road. He wasn't looking at the mall. He was already past it, already looking at what was next. I let him look. I turned back to the group. Route 17 is about 3 miles northeast, I said. The shelter is 30 miles from Route 17. We need vehicles. Phil said, without turning around. My trucks are 4 blocks east of the mall. We need to get to them. The east approach from outside was different from the east lot inside the perimeter. The mall was now a barrier between us and whatever had flooded the south lot. The east approach, from County Road, was accessible without going through the mall's perimeter. I said, can you get to them from the north side of the east approach? Phil said, yes. He turned then and looked at me directly. His face had reset into something cleaner, not the structural calculation of the last 2 weeks, something more direct. I know the route. I've been watching it. I nodded. 2 from my group with you, 3 of yours. He didn't argue. We moved north up County Road first, putting the building between us and the mall crowd, and then east along a side road that ran parallel to the commercial corridor. Phil knew the route. He moved through it with an efficiency that I had to acknowledge was real. We reached the church parking lot just before full dawn. Both trucks were there. Both had fuel. He'd told the truth about that at least. Phil's truck, the larger one, had keys in Phil's jacket pocket. The second truck had keys in the center console, as he told Aaron, who climbed in and started it. 16 people, 2 trucks. The math worked with room. I climbed into the passenger seat of the lead truck, Phil driving, because these were his vehicles, and I was not going to argue that point right now. And I looked at the road ahead as the engine started. Phil said, Route 17, northeast. I said, Route 17. He pulled out of the church lot onto the side road and turned northeast. From the back seat, Owen said, 29 minutes of drive time, roughly, if the roads are clear. Nobody answered him. We were all watching the road. The road. The road wasn't clear, not entirely, but it was navigable. Phil drove with the specific confidence of someone who'd been driving in these conditions long enough to understand the rules. Slow through clusters, wide arcs around stopped vehicles, no hesitation at intersections. The trucks were heavy enough that the slow driving through a thin cluster just moved through it, and Phil used that fact with a calm that was, I'll say it honestly, impressive. We passed through 3 clusters in the first 8 miles, not large ones. The density was lower out here than it had been in the commercial zones. The explosion had pulled things south and east, and the rural approaches had always been lighter. Around mile 15, we passed a farmhouse that had a light in the window. Yellow light, warm. Someone in there. Phil slowed but didn't stop. Nobody said anything. We all saw it, and we all kept going, because there were 16 of us already, and we were 30 miles from something that might be an answer, and the farmhouse light wasn't asking us for anything. It was just there. The way all the things left behind were just there. Not gone, not dead, just waiting for whatever came next. Trevor, in the seat behind me, said, "Someone's still in that house." Bev said, "I know." Trevor said, "We should have." Bev said, "I know." And we drove on. Mile 23, we hit a stopped vehicle in the road, a delivery truck, cab tilted, blocking both lanes. Phil stopped the lead truck and assessed. The ditch on the right was too soft. The tires would sink. The shoulder on the left was gravel, potentially passable. He got out. I got out. We looked at the shoulder together. Phil said, "We can make it." I said, "The drop at the edge is 6 inches, possible high center." He said, "We don't have time to unhook and push the delivery truck." I said, "The left shoulder slow." He said, "Yeah." We made it. Both trucks. The gravel shoulder holding. The tires barely losing traction. Back on the road, Dale exhaled from the back seat, in a way that suggested he'd been holding it. Mile 28, something weird happened. On the right side of the road, a tree, an old oak, massive, taking up a significant portion of the verge. On the tree, at about eye level with someone in a vehicle, a sign had been hung on a nail, a piece of plywood, painted white, with red letters. The sign said, Route 17 North, gates open, 9:11 AM, and 4 to 6 PM. Honk twice. Below that, in smaller letters, we know you're almost out of gas. There's a pump at the gate. I stared at that sign as we passed it. Owen, from the back. They've been watching the road. I said, yes. Phil said, what time is it? Dale said, about 6:10 AM. Gates opened at 9. We had almost 3 hours. Phil said, we'll wait at the gate. I said yes. The wait. We pulled both trucks up to what the sign had implied was the gate location and stopped. No gate visible yet. The road curved, and the fence line indicated something further ahead. The trucks sat on the shoulder, engines off. 16 people dispersed between 2 vehicles in the road verge, sitting on bumpers or standing. The morning was cold and gray, and the sun was somewhere behind the overcast, doing its best. Walt sat on a concrete block at the road edge and produced, from somewhere in his jacket, the locked journal, the one I'd handed back to him on day 6 without opening. He unlocked it with a combination, 747, I saw the numbers, opened it to a blank page, and started writing something with a short pencil stub. I said, what are you writing? He said, what I want to remember. I didn't push. Robbie found a flat rock at the road edge and sat on it, and ate one of the energy bars from his pack, the slow, focused eating of someone who has learned not to assume the next meal is guaranteed. He offered half to Angie, who was sitting near him. She took it without ceremony. Kyle sat with his back against the lead truck's front tire, sleeve down over his left arm, watching the tree line to the north. Not anxious, just watching. Phil stood near the front of the convoy, looking north toward where the gate would be, not speaking. His posture was different out here than it had been in the mall, less contained, like the space had given some of his held energy somewhere to go. I found myself thinking about the crack I'd heard in the south glass on day 88 night, how I'd registered it from 3 floors up, through concrete and steel, and known what it meant. 88 days of learning to hear that building, and then leaving it, and now the building was behind me and I was in open air listening to the early morning sounds of a road in winter, a crow somewhere, gravel shifting under a boot, the distant crack of something, could be anything out here, could just be a tree. Bev came to stand beside me. She said quietly, my ex-husband was at a conference in another city when this started. I don't know if he's... She stopped. I keep thinking I should care more about knowing. And then I think, well, Trevor is here, and Trevor is fine, so... I said, where's the conference city? She said a name about 400 miles away. I said, I don't know. She said, I know you don't. She paused. I'm not asking you to know. I'm just saying I think about it. We stood there for a while. At 8:47 a.m., we heard a vehicle from the north, an ATV, coming down the road from the gate direction, driven by a woman in her 40s in a heavy jacket. She stopped 20 yards from our convoy and looked at us without getting off the vehicle. She said, how many? I said, 16. She said, bites? I thought about Kyle. I thought about what he'd said to me. I waited for it and it didn't come. I said, nobody presenting symptoms. It was technically accurate. I held it in my mind, and it stayed technically accurate. She said, vehicles? 2, Phil said, stepping forward. Both with fuel. She looked at him, then at me, with the specific assessment of someone who's done this a lot. She said, who speaks for the group? Phil and I both started to speak at the same time. Then Phil stopped, looked at me. I said, I run the group's logistics and operations. He, I indicated Phil, managed our external resource acquisition. She looked at me for a moment, then, good enough. She keyed a radio on her hip, 16 people, 2 vehicles, coming in at the gate. Gate team, prepare to receive. She looked back at us. You'll be screened, quarantined for 24 hours as a group, then assessed for integration. She paused. We have 412 people inside already. You'll have job assignments within the first week. I said, what kind of jobs? She said, what can you do? I looked at the mall behind us, invisible now, A building on a road 30 miles south that might still be standing or might not. I said, building automation, mechanical systems. I can make a building work. I thought for a second. I can make anything work. She said, good. We need that. At 9:04 a.m., the gate opened. A vehicle gate in a heavy chain-link fence line, with concertina wire above it, and standing lights on the posts. Behind the fence, structures, converted commercial buildings, a parking structure that had been turned into something else, organized space. The trucks moved through first, then the people on foot, one by one, through the gate. I went last, not because it was dramatic, just because it's how I do things. You close the door behind you. You check the latch. The gate rolled closed behind me on its track with a sound that was not the same as the fire doors in the mall, not the weighted clunk of commercial-rated steel, but close enough. A closing sound. Something sealed behind, something new ahead. I turned and faced the compound. Walt was already talking to a man near the entrance who had the look of a maintenance supervisor. Walt's hands were moving in the way they moved when he was describing a mechanical problem. Specific gestures, tracing the shape of something in the air. Bev and Trevor were near a building entrance, where a woman in a Red Cross vest was taking notes. Trevor had his hand in his jacket pocket, which was where he'd been keeping the vibration monitoring notebook. Owen had his own notebook out. Dale was looking at a structure that appeared to be a medical facility and walking toward it without waiting for anyone to tell him to. Phil was standing near the trucks, talking to someone who seemed to be assessing the vehicles as a resource. He was explaining something about the fuel and the load capacity, and the other person was listening with the focused attention of someone for whom this information was immediately useful. Angie was nearby. She glanced at me. I said, "You okay?" She said, "Ask me in a week." Robbie was standing just inside the gate, looking at the compound with the same careful assessment he'd turned on me through the window of that house, taking it in, tallying. A kid who'd been doing that calculation for months. Who to trust, what to risk, when to move. Still doing it automatically. Probably couldn't turn it off. I walked over to him, said, "What do you think?" He said, 412 people, that's a lot. I said, "Yeah." He said, "They have a woman checking people in who's smiling." He paused. "I don't think she's faking it." I said, "No, I don't think so either." Kyle was standing near the perimeter fence, looking out, back toward the road we'd come in on. I watched him for a moment. He turned, noticed me watching, and, briefly, almost imperceptibly, pulled up his sleeve just a little. Just enough, showed the scar. Still there, still healed, still not what it was supposed to be. He pulled the sleeve back down. I nodded. He walked toward the main compound interior, and after a moment, I did too. After. I'll add this, because it matters, and because I've been writing it for myself, not for anyone else. And leaving it incomplete would be wrong. Kyle never changed. 6 months after we arrived at the Route 17 compound, his arm scar was a scar. He worked security rotations, the outside perimeter, which he said he preferred. He was good at the careful, patient work of watching. The compound's medical team took one look at his arm and sat with it for a long time. Not long enough to have answers. Long enough to take samples and start asking questions that none of us had the equipment to answer yet. It was the beginning of something. What that something was, I couldn't tell you, except that it involved people paying very close attention to one man who should have turned and didn't. Walt integrated into the compound's maintenance infrastructure within about 2 days and was effectively running it within 2 weeks. Not because he pushed for authority, but because every time a problem appeared, he'd already fixed it. That was Walt. The problem didn't wait for the organizational chart. Owen started teaching. Of course he did. They had 140 children in the compound ranging from 3 to 17, and the educational effort was organized in the most improvised and inconsistent way possible. Owen, who had 13 years in a history classroom and a specific talent for making systems work, showed up and quietly started making it work. Trevor helped him. Those two developed a dynamic that was good, the right dynamic at the right time. Bev ran the pharmacy. With Dale adjacent to her on the clinical side, they were the best medical team the compound had for months, until a doctor with obstetrics experience arrived in spring. Phil and I didn't become friends. I want to say this plainly, because writing around it would be less than honest. We reached a functional arrangement that worked at the compound level. He ran external operations, scouting, resource acquisition, vehicle deployment, and I ran facility systems. The boundary between us held, because the compound's leadership was clear and external and applied to both of us equally, which removed the leverage game that had been the problem inside the mall. He was good at what he did, I'll say that too. The things he brought to that compound in the first months: fuel, vehicles, 2 supply runs that found a seed warehouse 40 miles north that changed the compound's food trajectory entirely, were real contributions. He was good at it. We just weren't going to like each other, and we were both okay with that after a while. Robbie grew about 2 inches in the first 4 months. He was assigned to the gardens, an outdoor growing project using the south-facing slope of the parking structure, and he turned out to have a talent for it that nobody, including him, had anticipated. Something about the patience and the attention. He'd been practicing those things in a different context for months. The note from R was, I thought about this for a long time after we arrived. Who R was, whether they'd made it somewhere. The tunnel had been prepared by someone who knew the building and knew the situation, and had thought ahead. The knife, the map, the cached food, the key behind the light plate. All of it was deliberate, prepared by someone who understood that the tunnel was the exit, and the exit needed to be ready. I didn't know who R was for a long time. I asked people, mentioned it to Walt, mentioned it to a few of the compound's intake staff in case anyone had come through the area. Then, about 3 months after we arrived, a woman came to the compound from a group that had been moving through the county to the south. She had short hair and a worn jacket, and a specific kind of quietly efficient energy that I recognized from the moment she walked through the gate. She went to the intake desk, gave her name, took the quarantine wristband, and began answering the intake questions. I was passing the intake desk on the way to the facility systems office. I stopped. I said, "Your name." She looked up. "Rachel," she said. I said, "Were you at the mall, Eastgate Crossing?" Her face changed. Not surprise, more like recognition. "You found the note." I said, "You prepared the tunnel." She said, "I prepared it for me. I was coming back for it." She paused. I got delayed. I said, "It worked." She said, "How many?" I said 16 got out. She looked at me. Her eyes did something complicated that I didn't try to decode. She said, "Good." The intake worker, a young man who'd been waiting patiently through this exchange, said, "Ma'am, I just need to finish the intake form." She turned back to him and started answering questions again. I stood at the intake desk for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I walked to the facility systems office and sat down at the desk and pulled out the notes from the morning's equipment checks. The building here was different from the mall. Smaller, lower, different mechanical systems entirely. A mix of packaged units and some custom work done by the compound's own people during the months before we arrived. The building automation was improvised, hand-wired, held together by good intentions and electrical tape in some places. My first week, I'd made a list of 23 things that needed to be addressed. I picked up the list and found where I'd left off. The generator room here had a fuel consumption issue. The transfer pump sequencing was wrong. It was cycling too frequently, wearing the pump motor faster than it needed to. I'd need to get into the control logic and retune the differential set points. I knew how to do that. I'd been doing it for 11 years. I started writing the repair sequence in my notes. Outside, through the small window above the desk, the compound was doing its morning things. People moving. The specific productive sound of a large group of people who have decided to be alive and are working at it. Gardens and kitchens and the mechanical shop and the perimeter walk and the children somewhere making children sounds. A complete ongoing sound. I wrote the repair sequence for the generator room transfer pump. Third line of the sequence. I stopped. Put the pen down. I sat there for a while.